Pack it up, or I pack it for you. Your choice, vagrant. The boot catches the tent pole dead center. Canvas collapses inward, folding over a sleeping bag, a crate of canned food, and a woman who was already awake, had been awake since 4:53 a.m., lying still in the dark, listening to the cruiser's engine idle 20 yards away for 6 full minutes before the door opened. She does not flinch. She does not scream. She reaches beneath 3 layers of clothing, slides a composition notebook into a waterproof bag, and seals it before the second kick lands. The officer, 6'2", 240, body armor adding bulk he does not need, stands over the collapsed tent like a hunter over a carcass. His flashlight beam pins the woman as she crawls free. She's 44, thin from weeks of insufficient calories, her knuckles cracked from November cold. She wears a donated jacket 2 sizes too large and boots with duct tape over the left sole. He sees a vagrant, a problem, a number on a spreadsheet that needs to move so a city councilwoman can hold a press conference about clean waterfronts. He does not see the 41 hash marks in the notebook she just sealed, one for every day she has been documenting his department's crimes, and he does not know that the woman he just kicked awake once carried a wounded 4-star general 80 meters through enemy fire with 2 fractured ribs. That information will cost him his badge, his pension, and the next 3 years of his freedom. But right now, in the dark, with his boot on her tent and his flashlight in her eyes, he believes he is untouchable. The dispatch log will later confirm the call that brought him here. Dispatch record, 05:47 a.m., November 12th. Unit 47, responding to transient complaint. Dock Street corridor. Caller ID, anonymous, no crime reported. Cleared for wellness check. Dispatch operator, L. Fong, badge 197. A wellness check. The kind of call that ends with a pamphlet and a referral, not a boot through a tent pole at 5 in the morning, while a woman shields a notebook like it contains something more valuable than her own body. The waterproof bag disappears inside the jacket. The woman rises to her feet, slowly, hands visible, palms out, and somewhere inside the bag, pressed against her ribs, 41 days of timestamps, badge numbers, and direct quotes wait for the moment they will be read aloud in a room where the people who wrote them cannot leave. If this opening already has your blood pressure rising, hit that subscribe button right now, because this officer has no idea what's coming, and neither do you. The Dock Street encampment stretched along a half-mile strip of cracked asphalt between the Tacoma waterfront and the eastern fence line of Joint Base Lewis McChord. 23 tents arranged in a crooked row that followed the curve of the access road. No electricity, no running water. A portable toilet serviced every other Thursday by a county contractor who was always 3 days late. The nearest shelter, Pacific Gateway Mission, had a 92-person capacity and a 140-person wait list that hadn't moved in 11 weeks. The people who lived here had stopped waiting. Opal Serrano occupied tent 14, positioned midway along the row. Not by accident. From that position, she had clear sightlines to both ends of the access road, the JBLM fence perimeter, and the parking turnout where patrol units staged before making contact. She had selected the spot on her second day. It offered the best combination of observation angles and egress routes. She had not explained this reasoning to anyone. Her tent was different from the others in ways most people would not notice. The sleeping bag was rolled each morning into a precise rectangle. Not wadded, not stuffed, rolled with the zipper aligned and the fabric taut. Her boots sat beside the tent flap, toes pointing outward, laces tucked inside. 2 water bottles, filled and capped, lined the interior wall. A first aid kit, basic but complete, hung from a carabiner on the center pole. Everything had a place. Everything was positioned for rapid access or rapid departure. Dutch Pearson noticed. Dutch was 62, a Marine Corps veteran who had lost both legs below the knee to an IED in Fallujah and most of his faith in the VA to 17 years of delayed claims and canceled appointments. He occupied tent 11, 3 slots down, and navigated the camp in a wheelchair whose left brake had been broken since August. "You fold that thing like you're expecting inspection," Dutch said one morning, watching Opal flatten the edges of her sleeping bag with the heel of her hand. He said it with the half grin of someone who recognized the habit but couldn't quite place where he'd seen it before. Opal looked up, the briefest pause. Old habits. She did not elaborate. Dutch did not push. In the encampment, people respected the space between what was said and what was meant. Everyone here carried weight they had not asked for and stories they were not ready to tell. But Dutch filed the observation away, the precision, the economy of motion. The way she ate, protein first, carbohydrate second, methodical and deliberate, like someone who had been trained to fuel rather than enjoy. Little things. Things that did not add up to homeless. The morning after the tent collapse, Opal repaired the bent pole with duct tape and a splint made from a broken mop handle she had collected from the recycling station 2 weeks earlier. She did not file a complaint. She did not confront the officer who had kicked it. She wrote the date, the time, the badge number, and a physical description of the damage in her composition notebook, then sealed the notebook in its waterproof bag and tucked it beneath her jacket. 42 days, 42 entries. Each one written in handwriting so tight and gridded it looked like it had been produced on graph paper. Cross-referenced by date, badge number, location, weather conditions, and the names of any witnesses present. She added a line beneath the latest entry. November 12th, 0547, Thacker, B, badge 4417, tent pole destroyed during wellness check. No dispersal order issued. No 48-hour notice posted. No shelter availability confirmed. Then she went about her morning. Water from the communal jug, a protein bar from the supply she kept in a sealed container at the bottom of her pack. She ate it standing, watching the access road, cataloging the traffic pattern. First patrol pass at 5:30, second at 7:15, shift change at 8, civilian traffic increasing by 9. This was how she started every day. Observation, documentation, routine. Routine was cover. Routine was the thing that made you invisible. If you did the same thing at the same time in the same place for long enough, you became furniture. Background. A detail people stopped processing because the brain was wired to flag novelty, not repetition. Opal Serrano had been furniture for 42 days, and she intended to remain furniture for as long as it took. The officer who had kicked her tent was named Boone Thacker. 29 years old, 5 years on the Tacoma Police Department, transferred from a smaller jurisdiction in eastern Washington under circumstances that his personnel file described as lateral career development and his former colleagues described as getting out before the excessive force complaint went to a hearing. He drove a department-issued Ford Explorer with unit number 47 stenciled on the door and a personalized license plate frame on his personal vehicle that read, "Back the Badge." Thacker called the Dock Street encampment Bum Beach. He said it on his radio, where it was recorded. He said it to other officers, who laughed or didn't, but never corrected him. He said it to the encampment residents themselves, usually while running his spotlight across their tents at 5 a.m., which was technically legal. The access road was public property, but served no law enforcement purpose beyond harassment. Opal had documented 14 spotlight passes in 42 days. She had documented Thacker by name in 9 of them. She had documented his partner, a quieter officer named Friel, who never initiated contact but never intervened in 7. She had documented everything, because documentation was the only weapon available to someone who had voluntarily surrendered every other kind. 3 days after the tent incident, Opal sat on a milk crate outside Tent 14, her notebook open on her knee, when Thacker's Explorer rolled to a stop on the access road. He stepped out, adjusted his duty belt, walked the perimeter of the camp with the leisurely authority of someone touring property he believed he owned. He stopped at Tent 14. "Serrano?" He read the name off a clipboard. "We've had multiple contacts now. You got somewhere to be?" "I'm within my rights under Martin versus Boise." Her voice was level, unhurried. "No shelter beds were available last night. I checked." Thacker stared at her. The case name meant nothing to him. She could see that in the brief vacancy behind his eyes, the half-second delay of someone hearing words they cannot categorize. "I don't know what that is." "It's a Ninth Circuit ruling. It means you can't criminalize sleeping outside when there's no available shelter. I'm not in violation of any statute." "I didn't say you were." "Then we're fine." He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, the kind of look designed to communicate that legal arguments were theoretical and his authority was physical. Then he walked back to his vehicle and keyed his radio. "Dispatch, 47. Another contact with repeat transient at Dock Street. Log it." The radio crackled, a voice she would later identify as Sergeant Lonnie Strait. "Copy, 47. Logging as chronic nuisance. I'll flag the file." Opal heard it clearly from 15 feet away. She wrote down the exact phrase, "chronic nuisance," the time, 9:41 a.m., and the voice she'd matched to Strait from a previous booking she'd witnessed through the precinct's front window. Chronic nuisance. Not a legal designation, not a charge code. An administrative label that would follow her through every subsequent contact, inflating her risk profile in a system designed to convert repetition into probable cause. She knew exactly what it meant. She had seen the technique before, in different uniforms, in different countries, applied to different people who shared nothing in common except that someone with power had decided they were inconvenient. That evening, she helped Dutch repair his wheelchair brake. The mechanism was simple, a tension cable that had slipped its housing, but Dutch's hands shook too badly to thread it back. "Arthritis," he said. Opal didn't comment on the tremor's rhythm, which looked less like arthritis and more like the residual nerve damage she'd seen in soldiers exposed to repeated blast concussions. She held the cable taut while he guided the housing clip. "You're good with your hands," Dutch said. "I fixed a few things." "Where'd you serve?" The question was casual, expected. Everyone in the camp had some version of this conversation eventually. "Army." "How long?" "A while." Dutch laughed. "That's not an answer. It's the one I've got." He accepted it. In the encampment, that was how trust worked, not through disclosure, but through consistent presence. You showed up, you helped. You didn't steal, didn't lie about the small things, didn't make promises the camp couldn't enforce. Over time, people decided you were safe. Not because you'd proven it with words, but because your actions had accumulated into something that words couldn't fake. Opal had been accumulating for 42 days. She intended to keep accumulating until the weight of what she'd gathered became impossible to ignore. Alma Reeves occupied Tent 9. 38 years old, former Army medic, 2 children currently in foster care because the state of Washington had determined that living in a tent did not constitute a stable home environment under RCW 13.34. 130. Even though the reason she lived in a tent was that her VA disability claim had been denied twice, and her civilian nursing license had lapsed while she was deployed, and relicensing required fees she couldn't pay, and clinical hours she couldn't complete without childcare she couldn't afford. The circularity was elegant in its cruelty. You couldn't get housing without income. You couldn't get income without licensing. You couldn't get licensing without childcare. You couldn't get childcare without housing. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, cycling people through bureaucratic loops that consumed years and produced nothing except documentation of their failure to escape. Alma mentioned the VA outreach worker who visited the camp on Thursdays. "Her name's Corinne. She's different from the others. Doesn't talk to you like you're already a lost cause." Opal listened, filed the detail. "Corinne. Thursdays, VA, outreach. Different. She actually looks at you when she talks," Alma continued. "Like she's trying to help, not just fill out a form. That's rare. It's non-existent. She's the first person from the VA who made me feel like my file wasn't just a number." Opal nodded. She would remember Corinne. She remembered everything. That night, through the laundromat window on Pacific Avenue, where she sometimes went to charge the single battery-powered device she carried, Opal watched a local news segment on the wall-mounted television. City Councilwoman Margot Kellaway stood at a podium with the Tacoma waterfront behind her, the encampment carefully framed out of the shot. "These encampments are a public health crisis," Kellaway said, her silver hair catching the studio lights, her posture communicating the specific breed of certainty that came from never having slept on concrete. "Clean corridors will restore dignity to our waterfront. We owe it to our residents, our businesses, and the veterans themselves, who deserve real solutions, not tent cities." Opal noted the date, the quote, and the specific framing. Dignity to our waterfront. Not dignity to the people living on it, to the waterfront itself, as if the concrete had feelings that the humans sleeping on it did not. She wrote it all down. Date, time, channel, quote, speaker. The notebook was getting thick. The orange placards appeared on a Tuesday morning. Opal woke at 5 a.m. She always woke at 5, no alarm, the internal clock calibrated by years of training she had not discussed with anyone, and found the notice zip-tied to her tent's front support pole. Bright orange, official seal, City of Tacoma Department of Public Works. She read it aloud, quietly, for the recorder she had buried in her jacket lining. Notice of encampment removal. Pursuant to Tacoma Municipal Code, Section 8.30.060. This encampment has been identified for clearance. Residents have 48 hours from the date of posting to remove personal belongings. Personal property not claimed will be transported to City Storage Facility at 3401 South Sprague Avenue. Items not retrieved within 60 days will be disposed of. Posted November 18th. She read it a second time, then a third. Not because she didn't understand it, but because she was checking it against the statute it cited. The notice was missing a required element. TMC 8.30.060, subsection C, required that any removal notice include a description of the inventory procedure, the specific process by which the city would catalog, tag, and store seized property so that residents could later identify and reclaim their belongings. This notice contained no such description, just the address of the storage facility and a 60-day deadline. The omission was not accidental. Including inventory procedures created accountability. Excluding them created deniability if property vanished between seizure and storage, and it always did because sanitation workers were not trained in evidence handling and didn't care about a homeless person's sleeping bag the way they'd care about a homeowner's television. The city could claim the item was not presented for inventory and wash its hands. Opal had seen this play before. Different city, different statute, same architecture of disposability. She walked tent to tent, not rallying, not shouting, just moving through the row with the same calm she brought to everything, speaking to each resident individually. "Document your belongings," she told Dutch, crouching beside his wheelchair. "Photograph everything if you can. Write your name on every bag. Make a list of what's inside each one." Why? Because when they take your things, you'll need proof of what was yours. And when you file a claim with the city, you'll need evidence that the property existed. Dutch studied her face. "You sound like you've done this before." "I've filed a report or two." The phrase landed with deliberate ambiguity. Filed a report. It could mean a complaint form at a city clerk's window. It could mean something else entirely. Opal let it sit. She told Alma the same thing, with an addition. "Keep a log, date, time, who said what. If they deviate from the posted procedure, note the deviation." Alma frowned. "Deviate how?" "If they don't inventory your belongings before loading them. If they damage something during removal, if they refuse to give you a receipt, any deviation from what the notice says, write it down." "You really think writing things down helps?" "I think writing things down is the difference between your word and theirs. And their word has a badge behind it. Yours needs paper." The 48 hours passed. The camp knew what was coming. Some residents packed what they could carry and left before dawn on the 20th. Scattering to underpasses and doorways across Tacoma's south side. Others stayed. Dutch stayed because his wheelchair couldn't navigate the terrain between Dock Street and the next viable camping area. Alma stayed because her Thursday VAPA appointment with Corinne was 2 days away, and she couldn't afford to miss it. Opal stayed because staying was the point. The sweep team arrived at 8 a.m. 4 officers, Thacker in the lead, naturally, a city sanitation truck with a hydraulic lift, and a white Honda Civic driven by Nolan Birch, a 26-year-old communications aide who worked for Councilwoman Kellaway and who held his phone in front of him like a shield, filming everything for the Councilwoman's social media accounts. Thacker approached the first occupied tent. The resident, a man Opal knew only as Gerald, Vietnam era, 71 years old, prone to coughing fits that sounded like they originated somewhere below his lungs, emerged slowly, carrying a plastic bag of clothing. "Let's go, Pops. Clock's ticking." Gerald shuffled past without making eye contact. The sanitation crew began dismantling his tent. No inventory, no tags, no receipt. Opal watched from tent 14. Her notebook was open. Her disposable camera, not a phone, because phones had GPS and SIM cards and metadata that could compromise an identity she was not ready to reveal, sat in her jacket pocket. She photographed the scene, the crew loading Gerald's tent into the truck without cataloging its contents, the orange placard still zip-tied to the pole, Birch filming from beside his car with the enthusiasm of someone producing content rather than documenting an eviction. The crew worked south, tent by tent. Each one collapsed, loaded, and driven away. Some residents argued, most didn't. The calculus was simple. Argue and risk arrest, or leave and risk losing your things. Either way, you lost. Gerald was the exception. When the sanitation worker tossed his plastic bag of clothing onto the truck bed instead of placing it, the bag split. Socks, a flannel shirt, and a small frame photograph of a woman in a nurse's uniform scattered across the asphalt. "My wife's picture." Gerald's voice cracked. He bent to retrieve it. Thacker stepped into his path. Not blocking, hovering. The posture of a man who wanted you to know he could stop you without technically stopping you. "Keep moving, Pops. You're slowing down the operation." "That's my wife. She passed in '09. "File a claim downtown. They'll catalog everything at the storage facility." Gerald reached past him. Thacker caught his wrist. Quick, practiced, the casually violent efficiency of someone who had grabbed 100 wrists and learned exactly how much force the body could absorb before it became a complaint. Gerald stumbled. His knees hit the pavement. The photograph skittered under the sanitation truck's rear wheel. Nobody helped him up. The 2 other officers on the sweep team watched without expression. Birch's phone was pointed the other direction, filming the crew loading tents with the efficiency of a well-organized operation. Opal watched Gerald pick himself up, watched him look at the photograph under the tire, the glass cracked now, the frame bent, watched him walk away without it, because retrieving it would require reaching under the truck, which would require proximity to Thacker, which would risk another grab, another stumble, another moment of powerlessness documented by nobody except a woman with a composition notebook and a memory that did not forgive. She wrote down Gerald's interaction: time, duration, the wrist grab, the fall, the photograph left behind, another entry, another debt the system was accumulating without realizing it was being tracked. They reached Tent 11. Dutch. "Morning, officer." Dutch's voice carried the particular steadiness of someone who had faced worse than a tent sweep and had decided long ago that fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Thacker didn't answer. He nodded at the sanitation crew. A worker, young, city uniform, heavy gloves, reached for the wheelchair cushion that sat on a crate beside Dutch's tent. It was a specialized pressure relief cushion, prescribed by the VA for Dutch's specific amputation profile, designed to prevent the pressure sores that could turn life-threatening for a double amputee without access to regular medical care. "That's medical equipment." Dutch's hand closed over the edge of the cushion. "You can't take that." "Everything in the clearance zone gets cleared." The worker looked to Thacker for confirmation. Thacker shrugged. "File a claim downtown." "That cushion was prescribed by the VA. It takes 4 months to get a replacement through the system. You take it, I get pressure sores. I get pressure sores, I end up in the ER. The ER bills go to the city. You want to explain that math to your supervisor?" Thacker's expression didn't change. The argument, logical, specific, economically sound, bounced off him like rain off body armor. He wasn't processing information. He was waiting for compliance. Opal stepped forward, not aggressively. She positioned herself beside Dutch's wheelchair, close enough to be present, far enough to avoid any claim of physical interference. "Adaptive medical equipment is exempt from seizure under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title 2, 42 U.S.C. Section 12132. You take his cushion, the city assumes liability for any resulting medical harm." Thacker turned to her. The look on his face was the same one he'd worn during their previous encounter, the blankness of someone hearing words in a language they understood grammatically, but not functionally. "Lady, I don't have time for your Wikipedia law degree." He reached past Dutch and pulled the cushion off the crate. Dutch's hand came with it, gripping the edge. For a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, they were locked in a tug-of-war over a piece of medical foam that had cost the VA $400 and the federal government 6 months of processing time. Thacker yanked harder. Dutch's grip broke. The wheelchair lurched sideways on the uneven ground. Dutch caught himself on the armrest, but the motion was violent enough that his residual limbs, which ended just below the knee and were fitted with silicone liners, slammed against the wheelchair's frame. Dutch made a sound, not a scream, a grunt. The kind of sound you make when pain arrives at a location that no longer exists, phantom nerves firing in tissue that was vaporized on a road in Fallujah 19 years ago. Opal wrote down the time, 8:22 a.m., the badge number, 4417, and the item seized. Her hand was steady, her breathing was controlled, her face showed nothing, but beneath the layers of donated clothing and calculated stillness, something burned. The same thing that had burned in Helmand when she'd watched officers mistreat detained civilians because the detainees couldn't fight back. The same thing that had burned in every VA waiting room where she'd watched veterans treated like inconveniences rather than patients. The slow, steady combustion of someone who understood injustice not as an abstraction, but as a series of specific actions committed by specific people at specific times, each one documented, each one waiting to be read aloud in a room where the people responsible could not walk away. Birch filmed the entire exchange. Thacker didn't object. Birch's footage would be edited to show compliance and efficiency. A clean corridor restored, a problem resolved. The wheelchair, the grunt, the cushion torn from a double amputee's hands. Those parts would not make the councilwoman's social media feed, but Opal's notebook would remember them, and her notebook did not edit. If you're already furious at these officers, wait until you hear what they do next. Hit that like button so this story reaches more people who need to hear it. The camp relocated. Not far. 2 blocks inland, to a church parking lot on South G Street, where the pastor had quietly told the congregation's outreach coordinator that he would not call the police on people sleeping in the lot as long as they respected the property. It was an unwritten agreement, fragile as tissue paper, dependent entirely on one man's conscience and a congregation that hadn't yet voted on whether compassion was worth the liability. 14 of the original 23 tents reassembled in the lot. The others dispersed, under bridges, into doorways, behind dumpsters. The geography changed. The circumstances didn't. Opal set up tent 14 in the northeast corner of the lot, where she had sight lines to the street entrance and the alley that ran behind the church. She repaired the tent pole, again, and arranged her belongings in the same configuration. Sleeping bag rolled, boots aligned, water bottles filled, notebook sealed, routine, cover, invisible. 4 days after the relocation, Thacker found them. Not a coincidence. The church lot was not on his patrol route, and the camp's new location had not been reported to the city. Someone had told him. Whether it was a neighbor's complaint, a councilwoman's aide's surveillance, or a department directive to track displaced encampments, the result was the same. Thacker's Explorer parked at the curb at 7:30 a.m., engine running, spotlight aimed at the row of tents that had dared to reassemble. He didn't enter the lot immediately. He sat in his vehicle for 12 minutes, Opal counted, engine idling, spotlight sweeping left to right in slow arcs. Psychological pressure. The automotive equivalent of a predator circling. When he finally stepped out, Alma was the first to meet him. She had been walking back from the portable bathroom at the edge of the lot, carrying her daughter's backpack, one of the few possessions she'd managed to keep through both children's placement and foster care. "This is private property," Alma said. "Church property. You need the pastor's permission to enter." "Public safety exception." Thacker didn't break stride. "Received a complaint about hazardous conditions, fire risk, propane tanks, open flames. There are no propane tanks here." He ignored her, walked past her. His shoulder caught hers as he passed. Not a collision, not exactly, but not an avoidance either. The controlled brush of a man who understood that physical contact below a certain threshold was plausibly deniable. She stumbled. The backpack strap slipped off her shoulder. She caught it before it hit the ground, but the motion forced her off balance, one knee bending toward the asphalt. "Watch where you're standing," Thacker said without looking back. Opal recorded the interaction from tent 14. Badge number. Time, 7:43 a.m. Contact type, shoulder check during authorized entry dispute. Witness, Alma Reeves. Thacker conducted a safety inspection that lasted 40 minutes and produced nothing except a citation for Dutch, an obstructed pathway violation because his wheelchair was positioned between two tents in a way that Thacker deemed a fire code violation. The citation was TMC 8.3.0.090 again. Another civil infraction, another data point for clean corridors. Dutch accepted the citation without argument, but when Thacker walked away, Dutch looked at Opal, and the question in his eyes was the same question every person in the camp carried. How long? How long until someone with power decides to see what you were seeing? Opal didn't answer. She couldn't, not yet. But she made a promise, silent, internal, binding, that the answer would come. That every citation, every shoulder check, every crushed photograph and stolen wheelchair cushion was being counted by someone whose count would eventually be heard in rooms where counting mattered. Perry Wicks arrived on a Thursday, 3 days after the church lot confrontation. He was new, or appeared to be. 35, white, clean-shaven, in a way that stood out among men who shaved when they could and didn't when they couldn't. He carried a backpack that looked recently purchased and a sleeping bag still creased from its retail packaging. "Hey, mind if I set up here?" He indicated a spot beside tent 14. "Free country." Opal didn't look up from her notebook. Wicks set up efficiently. Not clumsily. There was no fumbling with poles or stakes, no first-timer confusion about rainflies and footprints. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, which contradicted the new-from-the-store equipment. Small thing, but Opal noticed small things. Over the next 3 days, Wicks made himself useful. He shared supplies, granola bars, hand warmers, a propane stove that produced coffee strong enough to cut through November air. He was friendly, approachable, generous in the way that newcomers sometimes were when they were trying to buy trust quickly, and he asked questions. "Anyone here got a record? Warrants? Just asking so we can watch each other's backs." The question came on day 2, delivered with casual concern, as though criminal history were equivalent to food allergies, something you disclosed for mutual safety. Opal said nothing, but she watched 3 residents answer honestly, sharing details about old charges, outstanding fines, and parole conditions that would become weapons if repeated to the wrong person. Classic technique: build rapport, gather intelligence, create vulnerability files. Opal recognized it because she had been trained by the same institution that trained police informants. The approach was textbook: establish presence, provide value, ask increasingly specific questions, and document the answers for handlers who would use them to manufacture probable cause when the time came. She watched Wicks for 3 more days, noted details. He left camp at irregular intervals, not the pattern of someone visiting a shelter or a food bank, which operated on fixed schedules, but the pattern of someone attending meetings with flexible timing. He returned with fresh clothing, not shelter-issued, which was generic and tagged, but retail clothing with creases that suggested recent purchase or recent laundering in a private machine. And his phone. Everyone in the camp who had a phone had a prepaid model, slow to charge, limited data, screens cracked from rough handling. Wicks's phone charged to full in under an hour, which meant it was a newer model with fast charge capability. Not the phone of a man who'd been sleeping outside. On the second night of Wicks's presence, an incident clarified what he was. A camp resident named Tully, 51, Navy vet, bald, quiet, prone to nightmares that woke half the row, accused Wicks of going through his backpack while Tully was at the soup kitchen on Commerce Street. The accusation was loud enough to draw attention. "You touched my stuff!" Tully stood over Wicks's sleeping bag, fists clenched, shoulders shaking with the particular anger of a man whose possessions fit in a single bag and whose trust had been violated too many times to metabolize calmly. Wicks held both hands up, palms out, the gesture of de-escalation, but performed with a precision that didn't match a camp argument. It matched training. "Hey, easy. I was just looking for the can opener. I asked Dutch. He said you had one." Dutch didn't say anything. I already asked him. Tully shoved Wicks. Open palm, center chest. Wicks stumbled back, but he didn't stumble the way a civilian stumbles. His feet shifted into a bladed stance, left foot forward, weight on the balls. Recovery posture, defensive training. The kind of footwork you learned in an academy, not on the street. Then he caught himself. Reset. Went back to loose posture, hands up, face apologetic. But the 3 seconds of muscle memory had been visible, and Opal, watching from tent 14, had seen every frame. "Sorry, man. Misunderstanding. I'll stay out of your stuff." Tully backed off. The camp settled. No one else noticed the footwork. Opal added a line to her notebook. December 1st, 2137. Wicks, P. Physical altercation with Tully. Defensive stance. Bladed ball-of-foot weight distribution. Trained recovery. Consistent with law enforcement defensive tactics instruction. She did not confront him. Confrontation was premature. Instead, she added a new section to her notebook. Wicks, P. Arrival November 21st. Equipment new. Charging pattern inconsistent. Questions. Criminal history. Warrants, parole. Defensive stance trained. Possible CI. CI. Confidential informant. 2 letters that could explain everything about Perry Wicks. Or nothing if she was wrong. But Opal had spent enough years reading people to trust the instinct that said wrong was unlikely. The Thursday Fabua visit brought Corinne Muir to the church parking lot. She arrived at 10 a.m. in a white government sedan, carrying a clipboard and a rolling case of intake forms. 46 years old, 11 years with the VA's Homeless Veteran Outreach Program, the kind of tired that came not from laziness, but from caring too much about people the system had decided not to care about. Muir worked her way through the tents, intake forms, service verification, benefits eligibility screening, the bureaucracy of compassion, forms designed to help that functioned primarily as barriers, each one requiring documentation that homeless people by definition did not have easy access to. She reached tent 14. "Morning, I'm Corinne, VA, Outreach. Mind if I ask you some intake questions?" Opal sat on her crate, notebook closed for once, hands in her jacket pockets against the cold. "Go ahead." The questions were standard. Name. Last 4 of Social Security. Branch of service. Dates of service. Discharge status. Army, Opal said. Discharge status, honorable. Muir entered the information into a tablet. Opal watched her type. Watched the screen. Watched Muir's face. Something happened. It was subtle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't trained to read micro-expressions in people who were trained to hide them. A pause. Not a fumble, not confusion. A pause. The particular stillness of someone whose screen has just displayed information that doesn't match their expectations. Muir looked at the tablet. Looked at Opal. Back at the tablet. "Ms. Serrano, I'm going to flag your file for priority review." "That's not necessary. It's..." Muir hesitated. Chose her words. It's already flagged, actually. From a higher office. Which office? I'm not authorized to say, but I've been asked to ensure you're receiving adequate services. The exchange lasted 40 seconds. Muir moved on to the next tent, but the register had shifted, visibly, unmistakably. She had not called Opal honey or sweetheart, the default terms of endearment that outreach workers used with female clients. She had not used the slow, careful diction people reserved for those they assumed couldn't keep up. She had spoken to Opal the way you speak to someone whose file contains information you don't fully understand but know enough to respect. Opal palmed the observation, filed it, kept her face neutral, but inside she recalibrated. The flag in the VA system was expected. She had known it was there, had known it would surface eventually when someone ran her credentials. The question was how much information the flag contained and how far up the chain the alert would travel. If it traveled far enough, fast enough, her timeline would compress. And compression meant risk. She wrote nothing in the notebook about the VA visit. Some information was too sensitive for paper. Sergeant Lonnie Strait worked the booking desk at Tacoma's South Precinct with the meticulous detachment of a man who understood that paperwork was power. 41 years old, 14 years on the department, 0 complaints in his personnel file, not because he'd never done anything wrong, but because the things he did wrong were embedded in data entry fields that nobody audited and booking codes that nobody questioned. Straight's gift was bureaucratic. He could take a civil infraction, a parking ticket, a noise complaint, an administrative violation of a municipal code, and reclassify it as a criminal misdemeanor with 3 keystrokes. The original citation would still exist in the system, buried beneath the new charge like a fossil under sediment. Anyone who wanted to find the discrepancy would need to pull the original citation, compare it to the booking entry, and notice that the charge codes didn't match. In 14 years, nobody had. 3 weeks after the encampment sweep, Thacker cited Opal during a second clearance operation at the church parking lot. The citation, failure to comply with posted notice, TMC 8.3, 0.090, a civil infraction carrying a maximum fine of $250, equivalent to a parking ticket. Opal accepted the citation. Read it. Noted the charge code, the date, and Thacker's badge number. Then she was transported to South Precinct for processing. Standard procedure for repeat contacts, Thacker explained, though Opal knew that standard procedure was whatever the arresting officer decided it was. At the booking desk, Strait entered the citation into the system. Opal watched his fingers on the keyboard. She had positioned herself at an angle where the monitor's reflection was visible in the plexiglass partition separating the booking area from the waiting room. She saw it happen. The charge code Thacker had written, TMC 8.3 0.090 civil infraction, was not what Strait typed. What Strait typed was RCW 9, 8.76.020, obstructing a law enforcement officer, a criminal misdemeanor, punishable by up to 90 days in jail. The citation Officer Thacker wrote was a civil infraction. Her voice was flat, factual. You've entered a criminal misdemeanor. Strait didn't look up. System auto-corrects based on prior contacts. Take it up with the judge. There is no autocorrect function in CJIS-compliant booking systems. The Criminal Justice Information Services standards require manual entry with supervisor authorization for any charge elevation above the original citation level. Now Strait looked up. The statement was specific, not vague complaint window language, not jailhouse lawyer parroting, but a precise technical reference to the federal database compliance framework that governed every law enforcement booking system in the country. His jaw tightened. A small muscle pulsed near his temple. The reaction of a man who had just heard someone speak a language he thought only insiders knew. Sign the appearance notice. I'd like a copy of both entries, the original citation and the booking record. You'll get what the system generates. The system generates what you enter. I'd like a copy of what you entered. He printed one copy, the booking record, RCW 9, 8.76.020. No mention of the original civil infraction. Opal signed the appearance notice, accepted the printout, and memorized the case number before folding it into her jacket. Case number 2, 025-SP-04719. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. The discrepancy was documented, in her notebook, in her memory, and in a system that preserved both versions of the entry, even if Strait didn't know it. Booking systems maintained audit trails. Every keystroke logged, every modification timestamped. The original citation and Strait's altered entry would coexist in the database like two versions of a lie, waiting for someone to run the comparison query that would expose both. Strait watched her leave. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck, not the casual attention of a bureaucrat processing paperwork, but the focused assessment of someone who had just realized that the person he'd assumed was harmless might be something else entirely. Good. Let him wonder. Wondering was productive. Wondering made people cautious, and cautious people made different mistakes than reckless ones. More subtle, more defensible, but also more systematic. The kind of mistakes that built patterns. And patterns were what prosecutors used. 2 weeks passed. The church parking lot held, the pastor held, the congregation held, barely, with 3 members writing letters to the church board about liability concerns and property values, but the outreach coordinator had persuaded the majority that "what would we do" was a question that answered itself if you were paying attention. Opal continued her routine. Documentation, observation. The notebook grew thicker. She photographed the second set of orange notices when they appeared. Because they appeared, of course they appeared, the machine did not stop, and noted the same omission. No inventory procedure description. She helped Alma prepare for her VA benefits appeal. She fixed Dutch's wheelchair brake a second time when the cable slipped again. She watched Wicks. Wicks continued his pattern. Questions, generosity, absences that didn't align with shelter schedules, a phone that charged too fast, clothes that were too clean, the accumulated weight of details that said, "This man is not what he appears." On December 4th, Wicks offered Opal a duffel bag. "Shelter overflow," he said, holding it out with both hands, the gesture of someone presenting a gift. They had extra blankets. Figured you could use some. The bag was olive drab, canvas, the kind you could buy at any surplus store for $12. It was heavy, heavier than blankets alone would account for, but not so heavy that the weight was obvious. A person who wasn't thinking about it would accept the bag, stow it in their tent, and never examine the contents until it was too late. Opal was thinking about it. She accepted the bag, thanked him, carried it to tent 14, set it on the ground beside her crate, and did not open it. Instead, she sat on the crate, opened her notebook, and wrote, December 4th, 1423, Wicks, P., offered duffel bag, claims shelter overflow, weight inconsistent with stated contents, bag stored unopened, not integrated with personal property. She underlined the last sentence. Then she waited. 2 hours later, Thacker's Explorer rolled up to the church parking lot. Behind it, an animal control van, repurposed based on the painted-over lettering on the side panel, that Opal recognized as the K9 unit's transport vehicle. The dog handler was a woman Opal hadn't seen before. The dog, a Belgian Malinois, alert, leashed, led the handler through the camp perimeter. Not a random sweep. The handler walked directly to tent 14, directly to the duffel bag. The dog alerted, sat, pointed. The handler confirmed. Thacker was already moving. Step away from the tent. Opal stood, hands visible, palms out. The same position she'd held 42 days ago when his boot had collapsed her tent pole. Thacker unzipped the duffel bag. Inside, beneath 2 wool blankets that looked genuinely shelter-issued, was a small Ziploc bag containing a crystalline substance that Opal didn't need a field test to identify. Methamphetamine. Maybe 2 grams. Enough for a felony possession charge under RCW 69.5, 0.4, 013. Well, well. Thacker held up the Ziploc like a trophy. What do we have here? That bag was given to me approximately 2 hours ago by Perry Wicks. I did not open it. I did not know what was inside. Sure you didn't. I would like to note for any recording devices present that I am requesting Mr. Wicks be interviewed regarding the provenance of this bag. I'm also requesting that any relationship between Mr. Wicks and this department be disclosed pursuant to Brady v. Maryland, 1963. Thacker's hand closed around her arm. Not gently. His fingers dug into the space between her bicep and tricep, compressing the nerve bundle there in a way that was designed to produce compliance through pain without leaving visible bruising. A control technique, taught in academies, used in the field on people who couldn't document it. Opal did not pull away. She did not resist. She let the pain register, cataloged its location and intensity, medial nerve compression, approximately 40 pounds of grip pressure, consistent with a trained pain compliance hold, and filed it alongside every other data point she had collected. Turn around, hands behind your back. She complied. The handcuffs went on tight. 2 clicks passed snug, the metal biting into the bones of her wrist. She did not ask him to loosen them. Asking gave him a choice, and the choice would be no. The second officer, Friel, the quiet one, the partner who never initiated but never intervened, took her other arm. Together they walked her to the patrol vehicle. Friel's grip was professional, neutral. Thacker's was personal. She could feel the difference in the pressure, in the angle, in the way Thacker's thumb pressed the nerve point, even after compliance had been achieved. At the vehicle, Thacker opened the rear door. The standard courtesy, the textbook technique, was to place a hand on the detainee's head to prevent it from striking the doorframe during entry. Thacker's hand landed on the crown of her head and pushed down, not guiding, shoving. Her forehead caught the edge of the frame, not hard enough to cut, but hard enough to sting, hard enough to be deliberate. "Watch your head," Thacker said, 3 seconds after impact. The warning delivered after the harm. A script performed out of sequence for the benefit of the dash cam audio, while the physical reality had already occurred. Opal said nothing. She sat in the back seat. The vinyl smelled like fast food and chemical cleaner. Her wrists throbbed where the cuffs pressed bone. A dull ache was forming above her left eyebrow where the doorframe had met her skull. She cataloged all of it. Location, force, timing, the gap between the physical action and the verbal script. Details that would matter when the moment came to read them aloud. Dutch was shouting something from across the parking lot. She couldn't hear the words clearly through the closed vehicle window, but she could see him. Wheelchair at the edge of the lot, one arm raised, the other gripping his push rim as if he were about to try to cross the broken asphalt to reach her. Alma held him back, one hand on his shoulder, the gesture of someone who understood that intervention would mean a second arrest, and that the camp couldn't afford to lose 2 people to the system in the same afternoon. The vehicle pulled out. Thacker drove. Friel rode passenger. Nobody spoke. She was handcuffed, transported. Thacker read Miranda from a laminated card. Correctly, at least, before the custodial interrogation rather than at the moment of arrest, which was one of the few procedural elements he got right. At South Precinct, Straight was waiting. The booking was comprehensive. 3 charges. Count 1. Possession of methamphetamine, RCW 69.50.4013, Class C felony. Count 2. Possession within 1,000 feet of a school zone. Lister Elementary, 3 blocks east. RCW 69.50.435, enhanced penalty. Count 3. Obstruction of a law enforcement officer, RCW 9, A.76.02. Gross misdemeanor. The inflated charge from the previous booking, now attached to the new case as a prior pattern. Opal sat on the booking bench, wrists cuffed behind her back, and recited clearly enough for the booking camera mounted above the desk. For the record, the controlled substance found in the duffel bag at my campsite was introduced to my possession by a man named Perry Wicks, who provided the bag approximately 2 hours before the K9 search. I did not open the bag. I did not know its contents. I am requesting that Mr. Wicks be interviewed regarding the origin of the substance, and that any financial or operational relationship between Mr. Wicks and the Tacoma Police Department be disclosed to my defense counsel pursuant to Brady v. Maryland, 373 U.S. 83. The booking room went quiet. Not the quiet of agreement, or even the quiet of consideration, the quiet of recalculation, the specific silence that occurs when a person in a position of power realizes that the person they've been treating as powerless has just cited a Supreme Court case by volume and page number while handcuffed to a bench. Straight typed. The keyboard was the only sound. He did not acknowledge the statement. He did not make eye contact. He processed the booking with the focused efficiency of a man who wanted this particular interaction to be over as quickly as possible. Opal was photographed, fingerprinted. The fingerprint scan took 7 seconds. Standard biometric capture through the state's AFIS system, linked to the FBI's national database. She watched the screen, saw the progress bar, saw the result field populate with a code she recognized. Federal hold, sealed record, contact originating agency. The booking officer, not Straight, a younger officer processing the biometrics, frowned at the screen, tapped it twice as though the display might be malfunctioning, looked at Straight. "Sergeant, I've got a flag on the prints. Federal sealed record. System says to contact the originating agency." Straight walked over, looked at the screen, looked at Opal, back at the screen. The flag meant her prints were in a federal database, not the standard criminal database, but a restricted system that contained records for personnel with security clearances, undercover operatives, and protected witnesses. The sealed record designation meant her true identity was classified at a level that a municipal police sergeant was not authorized to access. It also meant that someone at the Department of Defense or the Inspector General's office, or wherever her authorization originated, would receive an automated notification that her prints had been run. A notification that would travel up a chain of command Straight couldn't see and didn't understand. But Straight didn't know any of that. What he saw was a system glitch, a database hiccup that occurred occasionally with veterans whose military records hadn't been properly separated from active duty systems. Common enough to dismiss, unusual enough to note. System error, Straight said. Happens with vets sometimes. Military records don't always purge clean. Processor through. The younger officer shrugged, cleared the flag, continued processing. Opal said nothing, but she watched the notification disappear from the screen, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who understood exactly how classified database alert systems worked, that the notification had already been sent. The flag had been dismissed locally, but federally, in a system that operated above municipal access levels, someone was now aware that Lieutenant Colonel Opal Serrano's fingerprints had been submitted by the Tacoma Police Department in connection with a felony drug arrest. The clock had started. The question was how fast the response would come, and whether it would come fast enough. They put her in a holding cell. Wing B. The cell smelled like industrial cleaner and decades of institutional misery, a smell Opal recognized from military detention facilities she had inspected in her previous career. The universal scent of places designed to contain human beings until someone decided what to do with them. She sat on the metal bench, back straight, hands on her knees, feet flat on the floor. The posture was unconscious, the default resting position of someone who had spent years in environments where relaxation was a vulnerability and alertness was survival. She began her verbal documentation. Quiet, precise. The cadence was clipped, structured, not the rambling self-narration of someone talking to stay sane, but the disciplined chronological reporting of someone constructing an official record. December 4th, approximately 16:30 hours. Placed in holding cell, Wing B, South Precinct. No booking number verbally confirmed. 3 charges entered. RCW 69.5 0.4 013. RCW 69.5 0.435. RCW 9 8.76.020. Fingerprint scan triggered federal sealed record flag. Flag dismissed by Sergeant Lonnie Straight as system error. Dismissal inconsistent with federal database protocol. Sealed record flags require originating agency contact, not local override. Officer Straight's override constitutes a potential violation of CJIS security policy, Section 5.1.1.5. She paused, listened to the building. Shift change sounds, doors opening and closing, voices rising and falling in the hallway, the particular rhythm of a police precinct transitioning from day watch to evening watch. She filed the pattern. Then she continued. Prior to arrest. Duffel bag provided by Perry Wicks at approximately 14:23 hours. Bag not opened. K9 search initiated approximately 1600 hours. 1 hour and 37 minutes after bag was received. Response time inconsistent with anonymous tip. Consistent with pre-planned operation where the K9 deployment was coordinated with the contraband placement. She let that observation settle into the silence of the cell. The timing was the tell. An anonymous tip about drugs in a homeless encampment would generate a response time measured in hours or days. Low priority, high volume, the kind of call that sat in a queue until a K9 unit was available. But this response had come in under 2 hours, which meant either the K9 was staged nearby in advance, or the handler had been notified before the bag was delivered. Either way, it meant coordination. Wicks was the delivery system. Thacker was the hammer, and Straight was the man who made the paperwork say whatever the operation needed it to say. The question was who had built the machine. Thacker didn't have the sophistication for operational planning. He was a blunt instrument, effective at intimidation, but incapable of the bureaucratic choreography required to run an informant and coordinate a timed search. Straight had the technical capability, but not the authority, which meant someone above both of them had designed this operation and authorized its execution. Deputy Chief Franklin Nye, 28 years on the department, the man who had told Straight to keep the paperwork clean, and who had built the Clean Corridors program's statistical framework around arrest numbers that justified the councilwoman's budget. Nye was the architect. Thacker was the demolition crew. Straight was the accountant who made the numbers add up. And Wicks was the tool, a paid informant whose function was to create the probable cause that the system needed to convert homeless people into statistics. Opal had seen this architecture before. In military intelligence, it was called a targeting chain, the sequence of assets and operations required to identify, locate, and neutralize a target. The terminology was different in civilian law enforcement, but the structure was identical. Identify the target. Develop intelligence. Create opportunity. Execute. Process. She was the target. The intelligence was Wicks's reporting. The opportunity was the duffel bag. The execution was the K9 search. And now Straight was processing. converting a manufactured encounter into official documentation that would follow her through the criminal justice system like a brand. The cell door opened at 11:22 p.m. Thacker. Alone. No partner, no booking officer, no second set of eyes. The hallway behind him was empty. She could hear the faint sound of a television from the break room 2 corridors over. Evening watch was skeleton crewed, a common staffing pattern that created exactly the kind of unsupervised access that policy manuals existed to prevent. "Camera in this wing's been down since Tuesday," Thacker said, stepping inside. He didn't close the door fully, left it cracked, a 4-inch gap between the frame and the steel. Enough to hear footsteps approaching, but not enough for anyone passing to see inside clearly. "I'd like this interaction documented," Opal said, standing from the bench. Not fast, not aggressive. Rising from seated to standing in one smooth motion, weight-centered, hands at her sides, visible. "Department standard operating procedure requires 2 officers present during any detainee contact. I make the calls here. Then you're making a documented procedural violation, Tacoma PD General Order 320.05, Detainee Contact Protocol." Thacker stepped closer. The cell was 8 feet by 6. Not much room for distance. His body filled the space between the door and the bench, blocking the exit route by simple geometry. "You think you're smart." His voice was lower now. Conversational. The tone of someone who wanted to be heard by one person and no others. "Citing laws, making my guys nervous." "I'm citing policies. Your department's policies, written to protect both detainees and officers. Who are you really?" "I'm the person you arrested." He grabbed her arm. The same grip as before, medial nerve compression, the space between bicep and tricep, but harder this time. Not compliance, control. The grip of a man who wanted to feel the person in front of him flinch. His other hand came up, open palm. He slapped her. Not the closed fist punch of someone trying to injure, but the flat hand strike of someone trying to degrade. The sound was sharp in the concrete cell, louder than the force behind it. Her head turned with the blow. She felt the sting bloom across her left cheek, felt the heat follow. She did not flinch. She did not cry out. She turned her face back to center and looked at him. "That's now on the record," she said. "Assault on a detainee in custody, RCW 9A.36.021, assault in the second degree." The citation, precise, statutory, delivered without raising her voice, landed harder than his hand. Thacker's face changed, the flush of adrenaline giving way to the colder recognition that he had just committed a criminal act against someone who was quoting the penal code at him, while the mark was still forming on her skin. He grabbed her collar. Both hands now, fists twisted in the fabric of her jacket, pulling her forward until their faces were inches apart. "You say anything, I'll bury you. I'll add resisting arrest to every charge. I'll make sure every officer in this precinct writes a statement that says you came at me. Your word against mine. And mine comes with a badge." Opal rotated her wrist inward, dropped her elbow, and broke his right-hand grip in one motion. Clean, economical, trained. Not a fighter's instinct, a professional's response. The kind of movement that came from thousands of repetitions in controlled environments, designed to make defensive techniques as automatic as breathing. His left hand held. She repeated the technique, wrist rotation, elbow drop, and freed herself completely. 2 grips broken in under 2 seconds. She stepped back, palms up. No strikes, no escalation, pure self-defense. But the technique was clean, trained, not instinctive. Thacker stumbled back. Not from force. The breaks hadn't involved striking or pushing, but from surprise. His right hand was numb where the wrist rotation had compressed his radial nerve. He shook it, the involuntary response to nerve pain, and stared at her. "Where'd you learn that?" "I've had a difficult life." The answer was absurd, and both of them knew it. That technique wasn't learned from a difficult life. It was learned from a curriculum, from repetition, from professionals who taught professionals. But the absurdity was the point. It denied him information while confirming that she possessed capabilities he hadn't anticipated. Thacker's breathing was audible now. Adrenaline. His hand was still numb. His professional assessment of the detainee, homeless, vulnerable, manageable, had just been invalidated by 3 seconds of physical interaction that he could neither explain nor ignore. "This isn't over," he said. "No, it isn't." He left. The door closed behind him. The lock engaged. The hallway returned to silence. Opal sat back down, back straight, hands on knees. She took 3 slow breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the technique taught in combat stress inoculation training, to regulate adrenaline after a confrontation. Then she resumed her verbal documentation. December 4th, 23:22 hours. Officer Boone Thacker, badge 4417, entered holding cell Wing B without a second officer present. Camera system confirmed non-operational by Officer Thacker's own statement. Physical contact initiated by Officer Thacker. Open hand strike to left side of face, followed by collar grab with both hands. Contact broken by defensive wrist rotation. No injuries to Officer Thacker. Detainee sustained contusion to left cheek consistent with a slap, and minor abrasion to left forehead sustained during transport when head was pushed into vehicle doorframe. Duration of contact, approximately 90 seconds. Officer departed at 23:24 hours. She paused, touched the mark on her cheek. It was warm, swelling slightly. By morning it would be visible, the kind of evidence that cameras could capture and medical records could confirm. She needed both. A photograph and a medical examination within 24 hours, before the mark faded into the invisible catalog of things that happened in cells where cameras were down since Tuesday. She added, Officer Thacker stated, quote, "Your word against mine, and mine comes with a badge." End quote. Statement constitutes consciousness of guilt regarding assault and indicates premeditated reliance on institutional credibility over evidentiary documentation. Then softer, barely above a whisper. Officer Thacker asked, "Who are you really?" Inquiry suggests awareness that detainee profile is inconsistent with assumed identity. Thacker's suspicion noted. Timeline may require acceleration. She listened to the building. The break room television had gone silent. The shift change was complete. The night watch had settled into its rhythm. Periodic patrol checks, booking desk staffing, the quiet hum of a precinct running on autopilot between midnight and dawn. In the cell across the corridor, someone was coughing, the deep, wet cough of untreated bronchitis. Another resident of Tacoma's invisible population, processing through the same system, occupying the same concrete box, breathing the same recycled air. Opal didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she knew that his cough had gone untreated long enough to become chronic, which meant the system that was holding him had failed to provide basic medical screening during booking, which meant another violation of custody standards that someone should be documenting, but probably wasn't. She couldn't document everything. That was the hardest lesson of the past 42 days. Not the cold, not the hunger, not the indignity of being treated like refuse by people whose salaries she had once helped pay through federal taxes. The hardest part was the scale of it. The sheer volume of small cruelties that accumulated daily, hourly, in spaces designed to be invisible, committed by people trained to believe their authority was absolute and their actions unaccountable. She could document what she witnessed. She could build a case from the evidence she gathered, but the man coughing across the corridor would not appear in her report. His untreated bronchitis would not become a finding. His name would not be read aloud in a hearing room. The system would continue to produce victims faster than any investigation could document them. That was the math. That was the reality. That was the difference between the justice you fought for and the justice you actually achieved. A gap that never closed completely, no matter how many notebooks you filled. Then silence. The building breathed around her. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of the break room television, the occasional crackle of a radio. The sounds of an institution operating on autopilot, its individual components performing their functions without coordination or oversight, each person in the building assuming that someone else was watching the things that mattered. Nobody was watching. That was the point. Deputy Chief Franklin Nye didn't come to the precinct often after hours. He was a daytime administrator, the kind of senior officer who managed by memo, who directed operations through chain of command, who kept his fingerprints off field decisions so that when things went wrong, the accountability trail stopped 2 levels below his office. But tonight, at 11:45 p.m., his silver Lexus pulled into the reserved parking space behind South Precinct. He entered through the back door, badge swipe access, no sign-in required for staff above the rank of captain. He walked past the booking desk, empty now, night shift processing handled by a single officer in the records room, and directly to Straight's office. Straight was still there, not unusual for a sergeant running an operation that required real-time monitoring. He had the Serrano booking file open on his terminal, 3 tabs active in his browser, one showing the Pierce County court calendar, one showing the CJIS query log, and one showing a database Nye recognized as the department's confidential informant payment ledger. This Serrano woman. Nye closed the office door behind him. He did not sit. 3 contacts in 2 weeks. Citations, now a felony possession. What's her story? Chronic nuisance. Straight recited the label he'd created. entrenched in the camp population, probably been on the streets for years. She cited Brady and booking. Jailhouse lawyer, they all pick things up. She cited CJIS security protocols. Straight paused. That was different. Brady was famous. Any regular in the system could have heard it from a cellmate or a public defender. But CJIS, the Criminal Justice Information Services Compliance Framework, was internal law enforcement infrastructure. Not the kind of thing that circulated in holding cells. Maybe she's got a legal background. Some of these vets end up in paralegal programs through the VA. Nye didn't respond immediately. He stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot, where Thacker's Explorer sat beside two other patrol vehicles, the department seal catching fluorescent light from the building's exterior fixtures. The fingerprints flagged. System error. I cleared it. You cleared a federal sealed record flag. It was a military records artifact. Happens all the time. It happens with records that haven't been properly separated. It does not happen with sealed files. Nye's voice was precise, careful. The voice of a man who understood that certain words, spoken in certain rooms, could become exhibits. What exactly did the flag say? Straight hesitated. The hesitation was informative. It meant he had read the flag's contents and was now calculating how much to disclose. Federal hold, sealed record, contact originating agency. And you overrode it. I processed it as a military artifact per standard department procedure for veteran contacts. Show me the standard department procedure. Silence. There was no standard department procedure for overriding federal sealed record flags. There was CJIS security policy, which required notification to the originating agency. There was common sense, which suggested that sealed federal records belonged to people the federal government had reasons to protect. And there was Straight's 14-year habit of clearing inconvenient obstacles from the booking process, a habit that had never been questioned because no one had ever bothered to look. Until now. Possibly, if the originating agency had received the automated notification, and they had, because the system was designed to be override-proof at the federal level, regardless of what local operators did, then someone in a building Straight had never entered and Nye had never visited was already aware that their person had been processed through a municipal booking system. Nye turned from the window. His expression was the expression of a man who had survived 28 years in law enforcement by recognizing the difference between a problem and a problem. The first kind required paperwork. The second kind required the specific attention he was giving it right now. Keep processing, but make sure the paperwork is clean. No irregularities, no shortcuts. Counsel's watching the clean corridors numbers, and I don't want any technicality dismissals embarrassing us. He paused at the door. His hand rested on the frame, and for a moment the overhead fluorescent caught the class ring on his right hand. University of Washington, Criminal Justice. The degree that had launched a career built on the principle that systems could be managed if you understood which levers to pull and which records to keep clean. And Straight, find out who she is, quietly. No database queries, no outside calls, just listen. If she talks to anyone in holding, if she says anything that explains why a federal sealed record flag attached to a homeless woman in a tent camp, I want to know about it before anyone else does. Understood. And one more thing. Nye's voice dropped. The informant program, WIX. If she mentioned Brady by name, she knows about discovery obligations. That means if this goes to arraignment and a public defender files a standard discovery motion, we have to disclose WIX. Every payment, every contact, every report. Are those files clean? Straight's pause lasted a full second too long. I'll review them tonight. You'll review them now. He left. Straight watched him go. Then he turned back to his terminal and opened the CJIS query log. The federal sealed record flag was listed in the audit trail. Flagged, cleared, time-stamped with his badge number. A record that he had overridden a federal database notification without contacting the originating agency. In 14 years, nobody had audited these logs. But in a secure system that operated above Straight's access level, in a network that monitored sealed record queries the way a security system monitored unauthorized access to a vault, the notification had already triggered an alert. The alert had traveled from the AFIS biometric database to the Department of Defense Biometric Identity Management Agency. From there, it had been routed, automatically, per standing protocol, to the Office of the Inspector General. From there, a human being had read the notification, cross-referenced the name with an active investigation file, and picked up a phone. This story is about to break wide open. Make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell on, because Part 2 is going to deliver justice you won't believe. The phone rang at Joint Base Lewis McChord at 06:37 hours on December 5th. Not in the main switchboard, not in the Public Affairs Office, in the private office of Commanding General Tyson Embry, I Corps, the man whose life Opal Serrano had saved 10 years ago in Helmand Province, and whose authorization signature appeared on page 1 of the DoD Inspector General investigation file that had sent her into a tent on Dock Street 42 days earlier. Embry listened, asked 3 questions, made 2 calls. The first was to the Inspector General's office in Arlington. The second was to a JAG Corps captain named Ren Fogarty, who specialized in civil rights violations involving military personnel. Then he opened his desk drawer. Inside, beneath routine correspondence and a framed photograph of his family, was a folder. Red cover, classified markings. Inside the folder, a document he had read enough times to have memorized but kept returning to because the words on it reminded him of something most people in his position eventually forgot. That duty was not about rank or protocol or career management. Duty was about debts. The document was a Silver Star citation, dated March 14, 2014. It described, in the compressed language of military commendation, how then-Captain Opal Serrano had exposed herself to enemy fire during a convoy ambush in Helmand Province to extract 3 wounded soldiers, including then-Colonel Tyson Embry, from a disabled MRAP under direct attack. 2 fractured ribs, a collapsed lung, 80 meters of open terrain under machine gun fire. She had carried him, and he had promised himself, in the aid station, half-conscious, watching her own injuries being treated 3 cots over, that if the day ever came when she needed someone to carry her, he would not fail. The day had come. He closed the folder, picked up his phone, called the motor pool. I need 3 vehicles. Class A detail. South Precinct, Tacoma Police Department. We leave at 0800. In Wing B of South Precinct, Opal Serrano sat on a metal bench in a holding cell that smelled like cleaner and concrete. Her notebook was sealed in its waterproof bag, pressed against her ribs beneath 3 layers of clothing. 42 days of documentation. 14 spotlight passes, 9 direct contacts with Thacker, 3 booking discrepancies, 1 planted duffel bag, 1 camera malfunction, 1 nerve compression grip that would leave a bruise she would photograph as soon as she had access to a camera. She did not know that Embry was coming. The system she had activated by allowing her fingerprints to enter the federal database was designed to operate without her input. A tripwire, not a switch. She had pulled the wire. What happened next was beyond her control, but she was not worried. She was patient. She had been patient for 42 days, sleeping on concrete, eating protein bars, documenting crimes committed by people who believed they were beyond accountability because their victims were invisible. Invisible was a choice she had made. Invisible was a weapon she had deployed. And now, sitting in a cell that smelled like every other cell she had ever inspected in her career, she waited for the moment when invisible would become the most visible thing in the room. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the building, a radio crackled. Shift change approached. The building prepared to cycle through another rotation of officers who would perform their duties without questioning the system that employed them, each one assuming that the machinery was functioning as designed. And in the morning, 3 black SUVs would pull into the visitor parking lot of South Precinct, carrying 4 stars, a JAG captain, a CID agent, and 42 days of evidence that would burn through the machinery like acid through paper. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Opal Serrano sat in silence, counting the seconds the way she had counted them in Helmand. One at a time, each one a step closer to the moment when patience would become power, and the people who had mistaken her stillness for weakness would understand too late what they had been standing next to all along. The light buzzed, the building breathed, the notebook waited, and somewhere between the precinct and Joint Base Lewis McChord, a 4-star general was reading a Silver Star citation for the 15th time, remembering the weight of a woman who had carried him through fire, and deciding that the morning's drive to Tacoma was the smallest debt he had ever been asked to repay. Morning arrived the way it always did in Holding, not through windows, because Wing B didn't have windows, but through sound. The shift change at 0600 brought heavier footsteps, louder voices, the clatter of a fresh pot of coffee hitting the break room counter 2 corridors away. The building woke up in layers, each one adding volume to the institutional hum that had never fully gone silent. Opal had not slept. Not because she couldn't. Years of training had given her the ability to sleep in any position, on any surface, in any condition short of active combat. But because sleeping in a cell where cameras were down since Tuesday, and an officer had slapped her 5 hours ago, was a calculation she chose not to make. Instead, she had spent the hours between midnight and dawn organizing. Not physically, her possessions were limited to the clothes she wore and the notebook sealed against her ribs, but mentally. constructing the chronological framework of evidence she had gathered over 42 days, arranging it in the order it would need to be presented, identifying gaps that would need to be filled, and connections that would need to be explained to people who hadn't been there. The evidence existed in three forms: the notebook, handwritten, dated, cross-referenced; the audio recorder, a device the size of a shirt button, embedded in the lining of her jacket, which had been capturing sound continuously since October 1st, and whose memory card held over 900 hours of ambient audio, including every conversation, every radio transmission, and every threat that had occurred within its range; and the photographs, taken with a disposable camera that sat in the waterproof bag alongside the notebook, its film cartridge containing 36 frames of badge numbers, posted notices, seized property, and the faces of officers who did not know they were being documented. Three forms of evidence, three layers of redundancy. Because Opal understood something that most civilians didn't: evidence disappeared. Not through conspiracy usually, but through the accumulated indifference of systems that processed information, like assembly lines, processed material, losing pieces along the way because no individual worker was responsible for the whole. The notebook was her primary record. The audio was her corroboration. The photographs were her authentication. Together they formed a file that would be difficult to attack, expensive to suppress, and devastating to the people whose names appeared inside. She ran through the key entries, the way a prosecutor rehearses an opening statement, testing each one for clarity and completeness. Entry 1. November 12th. Dispatch log, Unit 47, responding to anonymous transient complaint. No crime reported. Cleared as wellness check. Officer Boone Thacker, badge 4417, arrived at 0547. Destroyed tent pole with a kick. No dispersal order read. No 48-hour notice posted. No shelter availability confirmed. Audio capture confirmed via device RK7741. She could hear Thacker's voice on the recording. She had listened to it twice during the early hours, running the audio in her memory the way she had been trained to review intelligence recordings in the field. The voice was clear. The words were unambiguous. The timestamp was embedded in the device's metadata, tamper-proof, synced to GPS satellite time. Entry 2, November 18th. Encampment removal notice posted. Tacoma Municipal Code Section 8.30.06 cited as authority. Notice missing required inventory procedure description per subsection C. Photograph taken, frame 11, disposable camera serial B 44921. Entry 3, November 20th. Encampment sweep conducted. Adaptive medical equipment seized from Dutch Pearson, VA prescribed pressure relief wheelchair cushion. Seizure conducted by Officer Thacker over verbal objection citing ADA Title II. Witness, Opal Serrano, Alma Reeves. Photograph taken, frames 12 through 15. Entry 4, November 20th. Gerald, last name unknown, wrist grabbed by Thacker during property dispute. Subject fell to pavement. Frame photograph of deceased spouse damaged during fall. No medical attention offered. No use of force report filed by responding officers. Entry 5, November 26th. Citation issued for failure to comply with posted notice. TMC 8.30.090. Civil infraction. Citation entered by Sergeant Lonnie Strait, badge 6102, as RCW 9A.76.02. Criminal misdemeanor. Charge elevation performed without supervisor authorization. CJIS compliance violation documented. Booking sheet case number 2, 025-SP-04719. Entry 6, November 28th. Officer Thacker conducted unauthorized detainee contact in Wing B, holding cell. No second officer present. Camera system non-operational, confirmed by Thacker's own statement. Bodycam metadata later confirmed. Camera deactivated 22:14 hours, reactivated 22:27 hours. 10-minute gap during contact. Tacoma PD, General Order 320. 05 requires continuous activation during detainee interactions. Entry 7, December 1st. Perry Wicks. Possible confidential informant. Physical altercation with camp resident Tully revealed defensive stance consistent with law enforcement training. Equipment, clothing, and phone charging patterns inconsistent with stated homeless status. Entry 8, December 4th. Duffel bag provided by Wicks at 14:23 hours. K9 search initiated at approximately 1600 hours. Response time, 1 hour 37 minutes. Inconsistent with anonymous tip protocol. Consistent with pre-coordinated operation. Entry 9, December 4th. booking for felony possession. Charges stacked. RCW 69.50.4013, RCW 69.50.435, RCW 9, 8.76.020. Fingerprint scan triggered federal sealed record flag. Flag overridden by Sergeant Strait without originating agency contact. CJIS Security Policy. Section 5.1.1.5 Violation. Entry 10. December 4th, 23:22 hours. Officer Thacker entered Wing B, holding cell alone. Struck detainee, open hand slap to left cheek, grabbed detainee by collar with both hands, stated, "Your word against mine, and mine comes with a badge." Contact broken by detainee using defensive technique. Thacker departed 23:24 hours. Mark on left cheek visible. Forehead abrasion from transport. Head pushed into vehicle door frame during entry. 10 entries, 10 building blocks. Each one supported by audio or photograph or booking records that existed in databases Strait could alter, but not delete. Together, they formed a pattern. Not random misconduct, not isolated incidents, but systematic targeting of a vulnerable population by officers operating within an institutional framework that rewarded the behavior and punished its absence. The pattern had a name. In federal civil rights law, it was called a pattern or practice. Under 34 U.S.C. Section 12601, the Department of Justice had the authority to investigate and remediate law enforcement agencies that engaged in patterns or practices of constitutional violations. The statute didn't require intent, it required pattern. And pattern was exactly what 42 days of documentation had produced. Opal's cheek throbbed. The mark was darkening. She could feel the swelling when she pressed her jaw closed, the tender heat of subdermal bruising that would peak in 12 to 18 hours, and then begin the slow fade toward invisibility. She needed that mark photographed before it faded. She needed a medical examination that would establish the injury's timeline and consistency with a slap. She needed to be out of this cell. At 7:40 a.m., footsteps approached, heavier than the breakfast officers. 2 sets. One she recognized, the measured tread of someone carrying a clipboard. The other was lighter, quicker, accompanied by the soft squeak of rubber soles on institutional tile. The cell door opened. Officer Pham stood to one side. Beside her, carrying a rolling case and a tablet, was Corinne Muir. VA Outreach, Pham said. She's authorized for a welfare check on veteran detainees. 15 minutes. Muir stepped inside. The door remained open, Pham's compromise between protocol and supervision. Muir set her tablet on the bench beside Opal and opened the rolling case, which contained basic medical supplies: blood pressure cuff, pen light, bandages, antiseptic wipes. "Ms. Serrano." Muir's voice was different now. Not the warm, slightly harried tone of a VSA outreach worker running through intake forms at a tent encampment. This was careful, formal, the voice of someone who had spent the hours since their last encounter making phone calls she would not describe and receiving instructions she could not share. "Ma'am?" The word came out with a weight that didn't match its syllable count. "I've contacted my regional supervisor about your case, and my regional supervisor has contacted someone above her." That wasn't necessary. "Ma'am, with respect, it was." Muir paused. Selected her words the way an attorney selects exhibits, one at a time, each one chosen for a specific purpose. "Your file has a notation I've only seen twice in 11 years with the VA. I don't fully understand what it means, but my supervisor made it very clear. You are to receive priority assistance, and I am to report any mistreatment through a separate channel. Not through standard VA complaint procedures, through a separate channel." She produced a business card from her jacket pocket. Not VA letterhead. The card was plain white, no logo, no agency name, just a phone number and an extension. The kind of card that said government without specifying which part of the government, the calling card of agencies that operated between the visible structures of bureaucracy. Opal palmed the card without looking at it. Reflex. The practiced concealment of someone who had received sensitive materials in environments where observation was constant and trust was conditional. "There's a mark on your face," Muir said. Her tone shifted. Clinical now, medical. She reached for the pen light. "May I?" Opal tilted her chin. Muir examined the contusion. Left cheek, approximately 4 centimeters in diameter, consistent with an open hand strike delivered with moderate force. The pen light swept across the abrasion on her forehead. Smaller, linear, consistent with contact against a hard edge. "These are recent, not a question." "Last night, approximately 22 hours. I'm going to document this." Muir opened her tablet, typed rapidly. Visible contusion, left malar region, approximately 4 centimeters, consistent with blunt force contact. Linear abrasion, left supraorbital area, approximately 2 centimeters. Both injuries appear less than 12 hours old. Documented during VA welfare check, South Precinct Wing B, December 5, 0743 hours. She photographed both injuries, 3 angles for the cheek, 2 for the forehead, with her tablet's camera. Each photograph was time-stamped and GPS tagged by the device. These photographs and notes will be transmitted to my regional supervisor through the separate channel, Muir said. I want you to know that. I understand. Muir packed her supplies, closed the rolling case, stood for a moment in the cell doorway, looking at Opal with an expression that contained something Opal had not expected. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition. The specific look of a woman who had spent 11 years helping veterans that the system had discarded and who was now standing in front of a veteran the system had actively attacked, and who understood that the difference between discarded and attacked was merely one of intent. Ma'am. Muir's voice was barely above a whisper. Whatever you're doing here, I hope it's worth it. Ask the people still sleeping in tents. Muir left. The door closed. Pham's footsteps retreated down the corridor. Opal looked at the business card she had palmed, memorized the number, memorized the extension, slid the card into the waterproof bag alongside the notebook. Then she waited. The building's morning rhythm accelerated around her. Shift briefings, phone calls, the mechanical sounds of a bureaucracy waking up to process another day's intake of human complexity. At 8:27 a.m., the cell door opened again. Not Thacker. A different officer, younger, female, badge name Pam. She carried a plastic tray with a sandwich and a carton of milk. Breakfast. Your arraignment's scheduled for 10 a.m. Monday. Bail hearing at that time. Today is Friday. Correct. You're holding me until Monday for a bail hearing on charges that include a civil infraction reclassified as a misdemeanor and a possession charge based on a bag I never opened. Officer Pham's expression was neutral, professional. The expression of someone who had been told nothing about the detainee except the charges on the booking sheet and whose job was to deliver breakfast, not adjudicate complaints. I can note your objection for the duty sergeant. The duty sergeant is Lonnie Straight. He's the one who reclassified the charges. Pham paused. The briefest hesitation, not long enough to be called sympathy, but long enough to suggest that something about the statement had registered. I'll note your objection. She set the tray on the bench and left. The sandwich was white bread, processed cheese, no condiment. The milk carton was warm. Opal ate both. Dehydration and low blood sugar were tactical vulnerabilities. Personal preference was irrelevant. At 9:14 a.m., 47 minutes after breakfast, approximately 15 hours after the fingerprint flag had been dismissed from the local system and transmitted to the federal one, 3 black SUVs pulled into the visitor parking lot of South Precinct. If you thought this story couldn't get more intense, you're wrong. Make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell turned on, because what happens next is going to change everything. The vehicles were government-issue Chevrolet Suburbans, black tinted windows, GSA plates with prefixes that anyone who knew the federal fleet numbering system would recognize as Department of Defense. They parked in a row, doors opened simultaneously, with the coordinated precision of people who had rehearsed this kind of arrival for exactly the purpose it served, to communicate through choreography alone that the authority entering the building was several orders of magnitude above the authority currently inside it. General Tyson Embry exited the lead vehicle, Class A uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder, positioned on epaulettes that had been pressed that morning by a staff aide who understood that today's appearance was operational, not ceremonial. 57 years old, 6'1", built like a man who still ran 5 miles before dawn because the habit had outlasted the requirement. His face was composed, not angry, not theatrical, but carrying the specific gravity of someone who had commanded divisions in combat and was now applying that same command presence to a police precinct in Tacoma, Washington. Behind him, Captain Ren Fogarty, JAG Corps. 34 compact, carrying 2 document cases that together weighed more than her briefcase and contained enough paper to end several careers. A criminal investigation division agent, civilian clothes, credentials on a lanyard, expression that suggested he had already formed opinions about what he was going to find inside. A JAG Corps representative, older, silver-haired, quiet, the kind of attorney whose silence was more intimidating than most people's arguments. 2 military police in dress uniforms carrying additional document cases, their primary function not security, but visual communication. This is federal. This is serious. This is happening now. They entered the precinct through the main entrance. The lobby was standard municipal. Plastic chairs, a duty window, a metal detector that a civilian officer operated with the enthusiasm of someone who had been doing it for 9 years. The officer looked up, processed the uniform, the stars, the entourage. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm General Tyson Embry, Commanding General, 1st Corps, Joint Base Lewis McChord." The words were delivered without emphasis, but with the absolute clarity of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. "I'm here regarding a detainee, Opal Serrano." The officer's eyes moved from Embry to the stars to the entourage to the document cases. The calculation was visible, the quick institutional math of a low-ranking officer encountering authority that exceeded his entire chain of command by a factor he couldn't immediately quantify. Let me get the duty sergeant." Straight appeared 3 minutes later. He had been in his office reviewing the informant payment ledger, as Nye had instructed, and the interruption registered on his face as irritation before it registered as alarm. The irritation lasted approximately 2 seconds, the time it took to process 4 stars on a uniform in his precinct lobby at 9:17 on a Friday morning. "Sergeant?" Embry did not extend his hand. The omission was deliberate. "I'm here regarding a detainee in your custody, Opal Serrano, booked last night on 3 charges." "Sir, this is a city police matter." Straight's voice found its procedural footing, the bureaucratic reflex that served as a first line of defense. "Military jurisdiction doesn't apply to municipal arrests. I'm not asserting jurisdiction over your precinct, Sergeant. I'm informing you that the woman you are holding is Lieutenant Colonel Opal Serrano, United States Army, retired. Silver Star recipient, 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 101st Airborne Division." The lobby went quiet. Not the gradual settling of background noise, but the abrupt cessation that occurs when everyone in a room simultaneously stops doing whatever they were doing because what they are hearing requires full cognitive attention. "For the past 42 days, Embry continued, his voice unchanged, same volume, same cadence, same absolute control. Lieutenant Colonel Serrano has been operating as the lead field investigator for a Department of Defense Inspector General inquiry into the systemic abuse of homeless veterans by municipal law enforcement in Pierce County. Her investigation was authorized under DoD Directive 5106-01 and coordinated with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." Straight did not speak. His jaw worked, the involuntary motion of someone whose mouth was attempting to form words that his brain had not yet authorized. Behind him, through the glass partition that separated the lobby from the booking area, Thacker was visible. He had arrived for his morning shift at 8:45, early for a man who typically clocked in at 2 minutes before the hour, and was standing beside the booking desk with a coffee cup in one hand and a clipboard in the other, reviewing the overnight arrest log as though this were any other Friday morning. He saw the uniforms first, then the stars, then the document cases. Then, through the glass, across the lobby, with the sudden freezing clarity of a man recognizing a face he had last seen in a holding cell at 11:22 the previous night, the woman standing behind the general. The coffee cup hit the floor. Not dropped. Released, the fingers opening involuntarily because the brain had redirected every resource to processing information that contradicted everything Thacker believed about the person he had arrested, struck, and threatened less than 12 hours ago. Brown liquid spread across the booking area floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. The 2 officers at the adjacent desks were staring at the lobby, at the stars, at the document cases, at the civilian-dressed woman beside a 4-star general who was speaking words that the glass partition muffled, but whose meaning was visible in Straight's face. Thacker set the clipboard down. His hands were shaking, not visibly, not to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but the clipboard rattled against the desk surface with a frequency that betrayed the adrenaline now flooding his system. He was calculating. She could see it through the glass, the rapid eye movement, the jaw tension, the particular stillness of a body preparing to fight or flee, while the mind searched desperately for a third option. There was no third option. Captain Fogarty stepped forward. She opened the first document case and placed a folder on the duty window's counter. DoD Inspector General Credentials, Authorization Number I-G-2025-0771. Issued to Lieutenant Colonel Opal Serrano, retired, Army Intelligence Branch. Investigation Scope, Pierce County Law Enforcement Interactions with Veteran Homeless Populations. Authorization signed by the Deputy Inspector General for Investigations. Effective date, October 1st of this year. She placed a second folder beside the first. Silver Star Citation, dated March 14, 2014. For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, while serving as intelligence officer, 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 101st Airborne Division. During a convoy ambush in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, then Captain Serrano exposed herself to direct enemy fire to extract 3 wounded soldiers, including then Colonel Tyson Embry, from a disabled mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle. Captain Serrano sustained 2 fractured ribs and a collapsed lung during the extraction. She carried the wounded across 80 meters of open terrain under sustained automatic weapons fire. Fogarty closed the document case, stepped back. Embry looked at Straight. The silence between them was not empty. It was loaded, pressurized, carrying the accumulated weight of everything Straight had done over the past 42 days, and everything he was now beginning to understand those actions would cost. She pulled me out of a burning MRAP, Sergeant. With 2 fractured ribs and a collapsed lung, she carried me 80 meters under fire. His voice dropped half a register, not louder, quieter, the kind of quiet that made people lean forward. And you put her in a holding cell on fabricated charges. You planted drugs through a paid informant. You inflated her booking to a felony, and one of your officers struck her in a cell where the cameras were conveniently disabled. Straight's face had gone the particular shade of gray that occurs when blood drains from the skin's surface in response to a threat the body cannot fight or flee. The physiological signature of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath him is not ground at all, but a trap door, and the mechanism has already been pulled. I need to call my deputy chief. Your deputy chief is welcome to join this conversation. But before you make that call, Sergeant, I want to be clear about something. Embry stepped closer to the duty window, close enough that Straight could see the combat service identification badge on the general's chest, the insignia of a man who had led soldiers in places where the difference between authority and accountability was measured in lives. This is not a request. This is notification. The findings of Lieutenant Colonel Serrano's investigation have already been transmitted to the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Washington and to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. What happens in this precinct today is documentation, not negotiation. Straight picked up the phone and dialed. Deputy Chief Franklin Nye arrived in 19 minutes. He drove from his home in North Tacoma at a speed that suggested urgency, but not panic, the measured response of a man who had been called to emergencies before and understood that arrival time communicated composure. He parked in the reserved spot, entered through the back door, walked the hallway to the conference room where Embry's team had been directed. He was wearing a suit, not his uniform. The choice was significant. A suit said civilian authority, said administrative response, said I am here as a department executive, not as a law enforcement officer. It also said his attorney had advised him, which meant he had called someone between Straight's phone call and his departure from home. The conference room was a standard municipal meeting space. Long table, plastic chairs, a whiteboard with dried-out markers. Embry sat at the head of the table. Fogarty sat beside him with both document cases open. The CID agent stood near the door, not blocking it. He didn't need to, but positioned to observe everyone who entered and everything that happened within the room. Nye entered, assessed the room, the 4 stars, the JAG captain, the documents already spread on the table, the military police flanking the entrance. General, I'm Deputy Chief Franklin Nye. His voice was controlled, professional. I've been informed there's a concern about one of our detainees. Concern isn't the word I'd use. Embry gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sit down, Deputy Chief. Nye sat. The chair scraped on institutional tile. The sound was too loud in the room's silence. Fogarty began. Deputy Chief Nye, I'm Captain Ren Fogarty, Judge Advocate General's Corps. I'm here in my capacity as legal advisor to the DoD Inspector General's investigation, designated IG 202-50771. The investigation was initiated following a formal complaint to the Secretary of Defense regarding the treatment of homeless veterans by municipal law enforcement in Pierce County. Lieutenant Colonel Serrano, retired, was embedded as the lead field investigator on October 1st. Over the course of 42 days, she documented the following. Fogarty opened the first folder. Her voice shifted, from introduction to presentation, the cadence of an attorney reading findings into a record. Finding 1. Officer Boone Thacker, badge 4417. 14 documented instances of encampment contact without legal basis. No active complaints, no dispatched calls, no posted notices authorizing contact. 3 instances of physical force against individuals experiencing homelessness. Destruction of tent property on November 12th, wrist grab, resulting in fall of a 71-year-old veteran on November 20th, seizure of VA-prescribed adaptive medical equipment from a double amputee veteran on November 20th. Each instance failed to meet the objective reasonableness standard established in Graham v. Connor, 490 U.S. 386. Potential violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. She turned the page. Finding 2. Officer Thacker continued. 2 instances of physical assault on a detainee in custody. December 4th, approximately 16:45 hours. Subject's head pushed into vehicle door frame during transport. December 4th, 23:22 hours. Open hand strike to detainee's face and collar grab with both hands. Conducted in a holding cell where the camera system had been disabled. Detainee sustained visible facial contusion and forehead abrasion. Both incidents constitute potential violations of RCW 9A.36.021, assault in the second degree, and 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Finding 3. Sergeant Lonnie Strait, Badge 6102. Systematic inflation of charges during booking. Civil infraction, TMC 8.3, 0.09. O entered as criminal misdemeanor, RCW 9, A.7, 6.02. O on November 26th, case number 2, 025-SP-04719. No supervisor authorization for charge elevation. Analysis of booking records over the investigation period reveals at least 9 additional cases of similar charge inflation affecting encampment residents, constituting a pattern. Potential evidence tampering under RCW 9A.72.150 and potential fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, false statements. Finding 4. A confidential informant program operating without proper judicial oversight or prosecutorial disclosure protocols. Payments totaling $6,800 dispersed from the Departmental Confidential Fund to at least 3 informants, including Perry Wicks, over a period beginning September of this year. Voucher numbers CF2025088 through CF2025104. Wicks's activities included the introduction of controlled substances into encampment residents' property on December 4th, constituting entrapment under Washington State versus Lively, 130 Washington 2nd 1. The informant program's existence was not disclosed to the Pierce County Prosecutor's Office for Brady compliance, creating a systemic discovery violation affecting all pending cases generated through informant-assisted operations. She paused. Place the page on the table. Let the silence function as punctuation. Finding 5. Bodycam metadata analysis for Unit 47. Officer Thacker's assigned vehicle. 17 instances of mid-contact camera deactivation over a 6-week period. Average gap duration, 8.4 minutes. Most significant gap, 10 minutes on November 28th, during the holding cell contact in which Officer Thacker assaulted the detainee. Tacoma PD General Order 320.05 requires continuous body cam activation during all detainee interactions. The pattern of deactivation constitutes potential obstruction under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, destruction, alteration, or falsification of records in federal investigations. Fogarty placed the final page on the table and looked at Nye. Finding 6. Supervisory responsibility. Deputy Chief Franklin Nye directed the prioritization of arrest statistics for the Clean Corridors program, creating an institutional incentive structure that rewarded charge inflation, aggressive contact without legal basis, and suppression of complaints. Internal communications recovered through FOIA, filed by a cooperating party during the investigation, include emails from your office directing precinct commanders to, quote, increase encampment contact metrics by 15% per quarter to demonstrate program efficacy to City Council, end quote. This directive, combined with the absence of oversight mechanisms for booking accuracy, informant management, and use of force reporting, establishes potential supervisory liability under Monell v. Department of Social Services, 436 U.S. 658. The room was silent. Nye had not moved during the reading. His hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, a posture that could read as calm or as bracing, the body anchoring itself against something it could feel arriving but could not stop. These findings, Fogarty concluded, have been transmitted to the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Washington and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. A formal request for a pattern or practice investigation under 34 U.S.C. Section 12601 has been filed. The Pierce County prosecutor has been notified of the Brady violations affecting pending cases, and the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission has been alerted to the use of force documentation for Officer Thacker's certification review. Nye spoke for the first time since sitting down. His voice was careful, each word selected and placed like a foot on uncertain terrain. I'll need to consult with the city attorney before responding to any of these findings. That's your right, Embry said. But while you consult, I want Lieutenant Colonel Serrano released. Immediately, all charges dropped, and I want her personal property, including a composition notebook, a disposable camera, and a jacket containing an audio recording device, returned to her intact with a documented chain of custody. I don't have the authority to drop charges. That's the prosecutor's decision. Then I suggest you call the prosecutor, because what I do have the authority to do is hold a press conference at Joint Base Lewis McChord in approximately, he checked his watch, 3 hours. And I can assure you, Deputy Chief, that the phrase fabricated drug charges against a decorated combat veteran will generate the kind of media coverage that makes prosecutors very responsive to phone calls. Nye stood, excused himself, made 2 calls from the hallway, one to the Pierce County Prosecutor's Office, one to the city attorney. Both conversations were brief. The results were predictable. Fogarty used the interval to complete the formal documentation. She recorded the time of notification, the names of all personnel present, and the specific documents delivered. The CID agent photographed the conference room, standard protocol, establishing that the findings had been presented in a controlled environment with witnesses. The JAG representative made notes on a legal pad, his handwriting small and precise, each notation a brick in a wall that the city's attorneys would eventually have to climb over, around, or through. In the booking area, visible through the conference room's interior window, Thacker had not moved from his position beside the desk. The coffee puddle had spread to the edge of his boots. His hands, which had struck a detainee's face 12 hours ago with the casual violence of a man who believed himself unaccountable, now hung at his sides with the specific uselessness of tools that have been permanently decommissioned. Straight stood behind the duty window, still processing. His terminal was still logged in. The booking system, the CJIS query log, the informant payment ledger, all visible on tabs he had not minimized. Evidence. Displayed on a screen that the CID agent had already photographed from the lobby through the glass partition. 14 years of unaudited keystrokes, summarized in 3 browser tabs that a federal investigator had documented in the time it took Nye to make 2 phone calls. The younger officer at the adjacent desk, the one who had flagged the fingerprint alert and been told it was a system error, sat very still, staring at his own terminal with the expression of someone who was rapidly recalculating every instruction he had followed and every order he had obeyed since joining the department. The building was quiet in the particular way that buildings become quiet when everyone inside them realizes simultaneously that the normal they had relied on no longer exists. At 10:07 a.m., December 5th, approximately 14 hours after her arrest, 42 days after she had first set up a tent on Dock Street, Opal Serrano walked out of the holding cell in Wing B of South Precinct, Tacoma Police Department. She wore the same clothes. 3 layers, donated jacket 2 sizes too large, boots with duct tape on the left sole. Her knuckles were still cracked from November cold. The mark on her left cheek was visible, a dark bloom the size of a palm print, the kind of evidence that photographs well and fades too quickly. Officer Pham returned her property in a clear plastic bag. Notebook, camera, jacket. The audio recorder was still in the jacket lining. She could feel its weight through the fabric. Undiscovered, undisturbed. 900 hours of audio that the department hadn't known existed and couldn't suppress now that it did. She signed the property release form. Read it first, every line. Noted that the form listed personal effects without itemizing them, which meant the department had no documented record of what they had seized and what they were returning. Another procedural gap, another data point. Then she walked into the lobby where Embry was waiting. He stood when he saw her. Not the perfunctory rise of a senior officer acknowledging a subordinate, but the deliberate full-bodied standing of a man who owed a specific debt to a specific person and intended to pay it publicly, in front of every officer, clerk, and civilian in the building who was watching, and they were all watching. "Colonel." "General." Her voice was steady, quiet. The same voice she had used for 42 days, the voice that had responded to Thacker's spotlight, Straight's inflated charges, and Wicks's duffel bag with the same controlled calm that she had carried through Helmand Province with 2 fractured ribs. "You didn't need to come personally. You carried me 80 meters, Opal. I can walk across a parking lot." She didn't smile. Neither did he. The moment wasn't about warmth. It was about recognition. The acknowledgement, stated aloud in the lobby of the precinct that had arrested her, that the woman they had processed as a vagrant was someone whose name appeared on a Silver Star citation, whose service record was classified at a level that required a general officer to access it, and whose 42 days in a tent had produced enough evidence to bring the full weight of the Department of Justice down on their department. They walked out together, through the lobby, past the duty window where Straight stood with his hands at his sides, watching them leave with the expression of a man who had just realized that the 14 years of unaudited keystrokes had ended. Past the booking area, where Thacker had finally moved, but only to sit down heavily in the nearest chair, his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, the posture of a man whose body had accepted what his mind was still refusing to process. Friel, the partner who never initiated, never intervened, never spoke up, stood beside the water cooler. He did not look at Opal as she passed. He looked at the floor. The expression on his face was not guilt, exactly. Guilt required acknowledgement. What Friel wore was the precursor to guilt, the first moment of recognition that silence had a cost, and that the cost was about to be presented with interest in a currency he could not afford. Past the metal detector, where the civilian officer stared at the 4 stars and the woman beside them, and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what the booking sheet had told him about the person in Wing B. He opened his mouth to say what he probably didn't know, and then closed it. Some questions answered themselves. This was one of them. Past the front door, into December air that smelled like rain and salt water, and the diesel exhaust of the government Suburbans idling in the lot. Fogarty was already on the phone. The CID agent was photographing the building's exterior. Standard documentation for a federal investigation file. The military police loaded the document cases into the rear vehicle. The morning shift was arriving. Officers pulling into the lot, stepping out of personal vehicles, adjusting duty belts, beginning the unconscious sequence of movements that marked the transition from civilian to authority. They stopped when they saw the SUVs, stopped when they saw the general, stopped when they saw the woman walking beside him. The woman they had seen through the holding cell's feed, the woman whose booking sheet they had glanced at during shift briefing, the woman who was supposed to be a chronic nuisance, a drug possession, a statistic for clean corridors, walking out the front door of their precinct beside a 4-star general, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had just finished a mission and was satisfied with the result. They would talk about this moment later. In the break room, in the locker room, in the cars on patrol where conversations happened that never appeared in reports. They would talk about the stars and the document cases and the coffee cup that Thacker dropped. They would talk about Straight's face and Nye's suit, and the particular quality of silence that had fallen over the building when the word colonel had been spoken in the lobby. And some of them, not all, but some, would begin to wonder whether the things they had seen over the past months and dismissed as normal were, in fact, the patterns that a decorated intelligence officer had been documenting while they assumed she was furniture. Opal stopped on the sidewalk, looked back at the building, South Precinct. Concrete and glass and institutional indifference, the physical manifestation of a system that had processed her as a problem and was now being processed as a defendant. She opened the waterproof bag, took out the notebook, held it for a moment. 42 days of handwriting, tight and gridded, cross-referenced by date and badge number, and the names of people who would read their own words quoted back to them in rooms they could not leave. Then she placed it in the document case Fogarty held open. Evidence. Chain of custody transferred. The notebook's work was done. What came next belonged to prosecutors, investigators, and a justice system that moved at the speed of paperwork and the pace of political will. If this reveal gave you chills, make sure you're subscribed, because the aftermath is going to show you exactly how the system protects itself and why real justice is never as clean as it should be. The Pierce County Prosecutor's Office moved fast, not from conscience, but from calculation. By 3 p.m. on December 5th, all charges against Opal Serrano had been dismissed. No public statement, no apology, just an entry in a court database, dismissed in the interest of justice, with a legal equivalent of a shrug that acknowledged wrongdoing without admitting it. By 5 p.m., the same prosecutor had reviewed 11 additional cases flagged by Fogarty's findings, encampment residents booked through South Precinct during the investigation period whose charges showed the same pattern of inflation that Straight had applied to Opal's file. Civil infractions entered as misdemeanors. Misdemeanors enhanced to felonies through school zone proximity calculations that applied a 1,000-foot radius with the indiscriminate geometry of a system that didn't distinguish between a person sleeping near a school and a person selling drugs to children. 9 of the 11 cases were dismissed outright. 2, involving defendants who had accepted plea deals before the investigation's findings were transmitted, were referred for post-conviction review, a process that would take months and might produce nothing except documentation that the original charges were tainted. The dismissals did not make news, the plea reviews would not produce headlines. Justice, at its most fundamental level, was an entry in a database that no one would read unless they were looking for it. Thacker was suspended without pay at 6 p.m. on December 5th. Not for the assault, not for the fabricated charges, not for the 14 spotlight passes, or the tent pole kick or the wheelchair cushion seizure. For failure to comply with body cam activation policy. The suspension was administrative, 3 days. The minimum the department could impose while the union contract's grievance process played out over the next 30 to 60 days. A second officer, Friel, the partner who had never initiated contact but never intervened, received a written reprimand for failure to report observed policy deviations. The reprimand would sit in his personnel file until his next annual review, at which point a supervisor would note it, check a box, and move on. Straight was reassigned, not suspended. Reassigned, transferred from booking to the records division, where his access to the booking system was revoked, but his salary, benefits, and pension contributions continued without interruption. An administrative hearing was scheduled for March. The hearing would determine whether the charge inflation pattern constituted misconduct or administrative error. The distinction mattered. Misconduct could lead to termination. Administrative error led to retraining. Deputy Chief Franklin Nye was placed on paid administrative leave. The department's press release, 3 paragraphs, distributed to local media at 7:45 p.m. on a Friday evening, the traditional burial hour for stories the department hoped would die over the weekend, described the leave as pending the outcome of an independent review of departmental policies related to the Clean Corridors Initiative. Paid administrative leave. 3 words that, in the grammar of institutional accountability, meant, we acknowledge something happened, we are not going to say what, and the person responsible will continue to receive his salary while we figure out how to make this look like we're doing something without actually doing anything. Nye's attorney, a private defense lawyer whose fees would be covered by the Police Officers Guild, issued a statement. Deputy Chief Nye has served the Tacoma community with distinction for 28 years. He is confident that the independent review will demonstrate that all departmental policies were followed in accordance with city guidelines. Perry Wicks disappeared. Between Friday evening and Saturday morning, he vacated the church parking lot. His tent, sleeping bag, and backpack, the new from the store equipment that had been his first tell, were gone. His prepaid phone number was disconnected by Saturday afternoon. The department, when later asked about Wicks in a FOIA request filed by a local journalist, responded, "The Tacoma Police Department does not confirm or deny the existence of confidential informant relationships. Any records related to such programs are exempt from public disclosure under RCW 42.56.240. The denial was itself a confirmation. The statute they cited specifically governed law enforcement investigative records, which meant the records existed even if the department wouldn't release them. But the confirmation was academic. Wicks was gone. His testimony, which could have corroborated the entrapment finding, could have identified who had directed him to deliver the duffel bag, could have revealed how many other residents had been similarly targeted, was unavailable. Perhaps permanently. One tool in the machine, removed before it could be examined. The machine's operators knew how to protect themselves. Councilwoman Margot Kellaway held an emergency session of the City Council on the following Tuesday. The chambers were full. Residents, journalists, veterans advocacy groups, a representative from the ACLU of Washington who had driven down from Seattle, and a cluster of police union representatives who sat in the back row with the particular stillness of people who had been instructed by their attorneys to observe but not speak. Kellaway opened the session with a prepared statement. She did not apologize. Apology implied fault, and fault created liability, and liability was the one thing the city attorney had told her to avoid at all costs. Clean Corridors was designed with the community's best interests in mind, she read from a printed page, her voice carrying the modulated sincerity of someone who had practiced the tone in a mirror. If individual officers deviated from program guidelines, that reflects on those individuals, not on the policy itself, and not on the values this council has consistently upheld. Jerome Purcell, 47, the council's sole dissenting vote on Clean Corridors when it was originally passed, an attorney who had spent 20 years in legal aid before running for office, leaned into his microphone. Councilwoman, with respect, the findings transmitted to this council indicate that the deviations weren't individual. They were systematic. The charge inflation, the informant program, the body cam gaps. These patterns existed because the program's metric structure created incentives for exactly this behavior. Officers were rewarded for contact numbers. Contact numbers required targets. And the targets were people sleeping in tents, because this city hasn't built enough shelter beds to comply with Martin versus Boise. The program's metrics were designed for accountability, not targeting. Then explain why arrest rates in encampment zones increased 43% after clean corridors was implemented, while shelter capacity increased 0% over the same period. Kellaway did not have an answer for that. Or rather, she had an answer. The answer was that clean corridors was never about reducing homelessness. It was about reducing the visibility of homelessness, which was a different objective that served different constituencies and produced different outcomes. But it was not an answer she could say out loud in a room full of cameras and journalists. A woman in the public gallery stood, mid-50s, gray braids, wearing a sweatshirt with the logo of a veterans service organization. She did not wait to be recognized. "My name is Bernice Harlow. My husband served 2 tours in Iraq. He came home with a TBI and nowhere to live because the VA lost his paperwork 3 times. He was at the Dock Street camp. Your officer, Thacker, broke his reading glasses during a sweep in October. He can't read his own medication labels without those glasses. He filed a property claim with the city. You know what he got back? A form letter saying the item was not cataloged at the time of seizure." Kellaway's aide, Birch, stopped filming. The councilwoman's expression, carefully composed for the cameras, flickered. Not guilt, calculation. The rapid assessment of a politician measuring the distance between what was happening and what it would cost. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your husband's experience, but individual incidents don't reflect—" "Individual incidents?" Bernice Harlow's voice rose. Not shouting, rising, the way a wave rises before it breaks. "I have 14 names, 14 veterans from that camp. 3 had property destroyed. 2 had charges inflated from infractions to misdemeanors. 1, a double amputee, had his VA-prescribed wheelchair cushion taken and never returned. These aren't individual incidents, Councilwoman. These are your program's results." The chamber stirred. A journalist in the press section typed rapidly. The ACLU representative made a note on a legal pad. The union representatives in the back row maintained their instructed stillness, but one of them, younger, newer to the force, shifted in his seat with the visible discomfort of someone hearing facts he hadn't been briefed about. Purcell let the moment land. Then quietly, "I move to suspend the Clean Corridors Initiative pending a full independent review of its implementation, metrics, and outcomes." "Seconded," said Councilwoman Diane Ito, who had voted for Clean Corridors originally and was now performing the political arithmetic that told her continued support was more expensive than reversal. The motion to suspend Clean Corridors passed 5-4. Kellaway voted no. Her aide, Nolan Birch, filmed the vote count for her social media, though the caption he would later post, "Council suspends program amid unverified federal allegations," omitted the word bipartisan from the vote description and the word documented from the allegations characterization. The suspension was temporary, pending review. The kind of bureaucratic pause that could last 60 days or 6 months, or could be quietly rescinded when the media attention faded and the council's next budget cycle required a homelessness metric to present to constituents. Institutional memory was short. Institutional self-interest was long. The program would return in some form, under some name, because the political incentive that created it, the desire to make homelessness invisible rather than solve it, would outlast any single investigation. The Department of Justice responded to Fogarty's referral within 2 weeks. A preliminary assessment team, 3 attorneys from the Civil Rights Division's Special Litigation Section, arrived in Tacoma in late December. They set up in a conference room at the federal courthouse on Pacific Avenue and began the process of determining whether the documented pattern warranted a formal pattern or practice investigation under 34 U.S.C. Section 12,601. The assessment would take 3 to 6 months. If it produced a finding of reasonable cause, the DOJ would attempt to negotiate a consent decree, a court-monitored reform agreement, with the city. If the city refused to negotiate, the DOJ could file a civil lawsuit. If the lawsuit succeeded, a federal monitor would be appointed to oversee reforms. The timeline, from preliminary assessment to implemented reform, was measured in years, 3 at minimum, 5 realistically, 7 if the city's attorneys were skilled at delay, which they were, because delay was the primary tool of institutional defense, and the city had been defending itself against reform for decades. Opal Serrano did not attend the council session. She did not hold a press conference. She did not appear on local news or accept the interview requests that had begun arriving within hours of the charge's dismissal, routed through the DODIG's Public Affairs Office, which declined them all on her behalf. She returned to the encampment, not to Tent 14, The tent had been confiscated during her arrest and was now somewhere in the city storage facility on South Sprague Avenue, tagged with an inventory number that nobody would ever look up. She came in civilian clothes, different from the donated layers she had worn for 42 days, but not dramatically different. Jeans, a jacket, boots that fit. She found Dutch first. He was in the same spot. Tent 11, wheelchair brakes held together with the cable she had threaded for him twice. The cushion had not been replaced. He was sitting on a folded blanket. Heard what happened? Dutch didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had suspected something for weeks and was now having his suspicion confirmed, which was a different emotional register than surprise. Colonel, huh? Retired. You fixed my wheelchair brake. It needed fixing. Dutch laughed. The sound was brief and dry, the laugh of a man who understood that a retired lieutenant colonel sleeping in a tent for 42 days to document police abuse was both admirable and absurd, and that the absurdity was the point, that the system had become so broken that a decorated officer had to become homeless to prove what every homeless person already knew. So what happens now? Investigation, hearings, eventually maybe reform. How long? Years. Dutch nodded. He had been waiting for the VA to replace his wheelchair cushion for 4 months. He understood what years meant. Years meant that the people who were suffering now would continue to suffer while the system that produced their suffering was studied, analyzed, debated, and incrementally adjusted by people who had never slept on concrete. They give you back your cushion? No. I'll make some calls about that. Don't bother, Colonel. I've been making calls for 17 years. The VA's hold music is basically my theme song at this point. He said it with the grin he always wore when the joke was the only thing standing between him and the thing he couldn't say, that 17 years of waiting had taught him that the system's primary function was not to help veterans, but to process them, and that processing and helping were different activities that occasionally overlapped, but more often diverged. The cushion's in the system, Opal said. Fogarty's team flagged it as evidence of ADA violation. That means the city has to replace it or face a federal accessibility complaint. In the system. Dutch repeated the phrase with the particular flatness of a man who understood that in the system was where things went to age, not to happen. My legs are in the system too. Been waiting on a prosthetic fitting reassessment since March. They keep sending me letters saying they've updated my appointment, and the new appointment is always 3 months after the last one they canceled. He wheeled himself to the edge of his tent and pulled back the flap. Inside, arranged with the same precision Opal recognized from her own habits, were the contents of a life reduced to what fit in a 64-square-foot space. Sleeping bag, canned food, a dog-eared copy of a Louis L'Amour novel he'd been reading and rereading since October, a photograph of 2 young men in marine dress blues, Dutch and someone who might have been a brother or a friend or both, taped to the interior wall with medical tape. You want to know what I think? Dutch said, not looking at her. I think the investigation's going to produce a report. The report's going to produce a recommendation. The recommendation's going to produce a meeting. The meeting's going to produce a policy. And the policy's going to produce exactly nothing for the people still sleeping in these tents. Because that's what policies do. They give the system something to point at when someone asks why nothing changed. That's possible. It's not possible. It's probable. I've been through 3 investigations in 3 cities, 2 consent decrees, a federal monitor in Cleveland who wrote beautiful quarterly reports that nobody read. You know what changed? The letterhead on the forms I filled out. That's it. Same system. Different stationery. Opal didn't argue. She couldn't because Dutch was describing reality. Not cynicism, not defeatism, but the documented, verifiable reality of institutional reform as experienced by the people it was supposed to help. Consent decrees produced compliance reports. Compliance reports produced metrics. Metrics produced the appearance of progress. And the appearance of progress was often the system's primary product. Not progress itself, but its simulation, maintained at sufficient fidelity to satisfy monitors and journalists and politicians while the underlying structure remained intact. She had known this before she accepted the assignment. Had known it in the briefing room at JBLM when Embry had described the investigation's scope and objectives, and she had recognized, in the careful bureaucratic language of the mission file, the same gap between aspiration and outcome that defined every institutional reform effort she had ever witnessed. But she had accepted the assignment anyway, because the alternative, not documenting, not investigating, not building the record that would become the evidence, that would become the report that Dutch was right to be skeptical about, was worse. Not documenting meant the pattern continued without acknowledgement. Without acknowledgement, there was no record. Without record, there was no basis for change. And without a basis for change, the system's defenders could claim, with technical accuracy, that no problem existed, because the only evidence of the problem was the testimony of people the system had already discredited. That was the architecture of institutional immunity: discredit the witnesses, destroy the evidence, deny the pattern, and when someone managed to document the pattern despite the destruction and the discrediting, delay the response until the documentation aged into irrelevance. Opal's 42 days had broken the cycle at step 3. The pattern was documented, the evidence was preserved, the denial was no longer tenable, but steps 4 and 5, delay and dilute, were still available, and the system would use them, because systems always used every tool available to protect themselves. "You're right," she told Dutch. "It's probable, but probable isn't certain, and the difference between probable and certain is what people like you and me do next." Dutch looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he's deciding whether to believe something he wants to believe but has been burned too many times to trust. "I'll hold you to that, Colonel." "I'm counting on it." Alma was not at the camp. Opal asked. Dutch told her. Alma had been notified that her custody hearing had been moved up, not because the court was being generous, but because the publicity surrounding the encampment investigation had made the judge nervous about the optics of keeping children in foster care while their mother lived in a tent city that was now a federal crime scene. The hearing was scheduled for January. The outcome was not guaranteed. The court would still require evidence of stable housing, employment, and compliance with the service plan the Child Welfare Agency had imposed as conditions of reunification. "She's been staying at the Pacific Gateway shelter since Wednesday," Dutch said. "They found a bed for her after the news coverage. Funny how a bed opens up when cameras are pointed at the wait list." The observation was bitter and accurate. The shelter's 92-person capacity hadn't changed. The 140-person waitlist hadn't shrunk. But Alma's name had moved from position 87 to position 1 in the span of a single news cycle. Not because her need had increased, but because her visibility had. The system responded to attention, not to suffering. When attention faded, the response would fade with it, and the next person at position 87 would continue waiting. Opal left her phone number with Dutch. Her real phone number, the one that connected to a device with encryption and a contact list that included the Inspector General's office, the ACLU, and a veterans legal aid clinic that had already agreed to take Alma's custody case pro bono. Then she walked to the edge of the parking lot and stood for a moment, looking at the row of tents that had been her world for 42 days. 14 structures of nylon and aluminum poles, each one containing a human being whose service to the country had been repaid with indifference, whose rights had been violated by the people sworn to protect them, and whose stories would likely never be told in the rooms where policy was made and budgets were allocated. She had documented 10 entries, 10 building blocks. But the camp contained 23 stories, and across Tacoma, across Pierce County, across the state of Washington, there were thousands more. Each one a pattern, each one a practice, each one waiting for someone to care enough to write it down. General Embry had offered her a position, consulting role at JBLM, veteran advocacy, liaison between the military and local service providers, the kind of work that used her skills without requiring her to sleep on concrete. Good salary, benefits, an office with a window and a chair that wasn't a milk crate. She hadn't answered. The offer was generous and the work was real, but accepting it meant returning to a system, a different system, a better one, but a system nonetheless. And Opal had spent 42 days outside every system, documenting what systems did when they thought no one was watching. Stepping back inside felt like putting on a uniform she had already taken off. A letter arrived at her temporary housing 3 days later, VA stationery. Inside, an appointment notice for a benefits review, the kind of appointment that normally took 8 to 12 weeks to schedule, but had materialized in 3 days, which meant someone with authority had intervened. Clipped to the notice, on plain paper with no letterhead and no signature. A handwritten note. 3 words. Watched your 6. Military language. 6 o'clock. You're back. The direction you can't see. Someone had been watching her from a position she hadn't detected, protecting her from a threat she hadn't identified during the 42 days she had been watching everyone else. The note went into the notebook. The new notebook, the one she'd started the morning after her release, because the original was evidence now, sealed in a federal document case, its contents being transcribed and authenticated by a team at the Inspector General's office. She didn't know who sent the note. Muir, the VA outreach worker whose database query had surfaced the flag, someone at the IG office who had been monitoring her field investigation from a distance, an officer inside South Precinct who had observed what was happening, said nothing during the investigation, and was now offering the smallest possible gesture of solidarity. 3 words on unlined paper, unsigned, untraceable. The whispered confession of a conscience that had arrived too late to prevent harm, but early enough to acknowledge it. She didn't know. And the not knowing was its own kind of open thread, a question that would persist after the hearings and the assessments and the consent decrees, a reminder that justice was never complete, never final, never as clean as the people who demanded it needed it to be. 3 weeks after the charges were dropped, a records clerk at South Precinct filed a routine IT maintenance request.
The request was standard, a work order for quarterly servicing of the closed-circuit camera systems throughout the building. The clerk processed it without reading the details, because routine maintenance requests were routine, and reading the details was not part of the job. But the details mattered. Buried on page 3 of the work order, in the section labeled Prior Service History that listed previous maintenance performed on each camera system, was an entry for Wing B's holding cell cameras. The entry read, November 27th, camera system, Wing B holding cells, preventive maintenance, firmware update and lens calibration. Service performed by, badge number 6102. Duration, 45 minutes. System offline during service.
System restored and operational upon completion. Badge number 6102. Sergeant Lonnie Strait. The service had been performed the day before Thacker's assault on Opal in the holding cell. The day before the 10-minute camera gap that Fogarty's findings had attributed to body cam deactivation. But this wasn't the body cam. This was the fixed camera, the ceiling-mounted unit that recorded the holding cell area continuously, independent of any officer's body-worn device. Strait hadn't just deactivated Thacker's body cam. He had serviced, accessed, modified, potentially reconfigured the holding cell's fixed camera system 24 hours before the assault occurred. The 10-minute gap wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a malfunction. And it wasn't limited to a single officer's body-worn camera. It was infrastructure, planned, coordinated between the sergeant who controlled the booking system and the officer who controlled the cell. The work order sat in the maintenance file for 11 days before the DOJ's preliminary assessment team requested, as part of their standard document production, all IT maintenance records for South Precinct's camera systems dating back to January of the current year. When the records arrived, a junior attorney on the assessment team read the work order, read it again, cross-referenced badge number 6102 with the investigation's personnel roster, and flagged the document with a notation that would ensure it appeared in the first paragraph of the assessment team's preliminary report to the Civil Rights Division. The notation read, Potential pre-planning of evidence destruction. Refer for criminal investigation. Strait's administrative hearing, scheduled for March, was now the least of his problems. A criminal referral changed the calculus entirely, from administrative discipline, which carried consequences measured in career disruptions, to criminal prosecution, which carried consequences measured in years. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, evidence tampering, deprivation of rights under color of law. Each charge carried its own weight, its own timeline, its own set of discovery obligations that would peel back layers of the department's operations that Strait had spent 14 years keeping invisible. His attorney, paid by the police guild, whose fiduciary obligation was to the membership as a whole and not to any individual member, would advise him to cooperate, to provide testimony against Nye and Thacker in exchange for reduced exposure, to trade institutional loyalty for personal survival. Whether he would take that advice depended on calculations that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the game theory of institutional collapse. Who talks first, who talks loudest, who gets the best deal. The same mathematics that governed every corruption case, from municipal precincts to federal agencies. The first person through the door gets the lightest sentence. Somewhere in Tacoma, Perry Wicks was carrying a disconnected phone and a backpack of department-purchased supplies, deciding whether his confidential informant relationship constituted cooperation or conspiracy. Somewhere in the city attorney's office, a paralegal was reviewing the Clean Corridors program's internal emails, flagging the ones that contained the word metrics and the ones that contained the word targets and the ones that contained both. Somewhere in the VA system, a benefits review appointment was being processed for a woman whose file had a notation that a regional supervisor had seen only twice in 11 years. And somewhere on South G Street, in a church parking lot, where 14 tents held 14 veterans whose service to the country had been repaid with concrete and indifference, a man in a wheelchair was reading a Louis L'Amour novel for the 7th time, waiting for a cushion that was in the system and a prosthetic assessment that was 3 cancellations deep, counting the days the way soldiers count. one at a time, each one a small victory against the thing that wants you to stop counting. The preliminary report landed on a desk at the Department of Justice in late January. It was 47 pages long. It contained 12 findings, 6 recommendations, and a conclusion that used language the DOJ reserved for cases it intended to pursue aggressively. Reasonable cause exists to believe that the Tacoma Police Department has engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that deprives persons of rights, privileges, or immunities secured or protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States. The language was boilerplate. The consequences were not. A pattern or practice finding opened the door to a consent decree, a federal court order that would place the department under monitored reform for a minimum of 5 years. The monitor would review use of force policies, booking procedures, informant management, body cam compliance, and the institutional incentive structures that had produced the Clean Corridors program's statistical machinery. 5 years of federal oversight, 5 years of quarterly reports and compliance reviews, and the slow, grinding work of changing a culture that had taken decades to build. Or, and this was the part that the DOJ report didn't say, but everyone involved understood, 5 years of resistance. 5 years of union grievances and budget arguments and political pressure to soften the decree's requirements. 5 years of the system doing what systems always do when external pressure is applied. Bend enough to satisfy the monitors, resist enough to preserve the structure, and wait for the pressure to relent. Because pressure always relented. Investigations ended. Monitors were reassigned. Consent decrees were lifted. And the system, older, slightly reformed, fundamentally unchanged, continued. That was the math. That was the reality. That was the difference between the story people wanted to hear, the one where the hero exposes corruption, and the villains are punished, and the system is transformed overnight. And the story that actually happened, where a retired lieutenant colonel slept on concrete for 42 days, documented crimes committed by people who thought they were untouchable, and produced a report that might, if everything went right, result in incremental changes to a system that would generate new victims while the changes were being implemented. Opal knew this. She had known it before she accepted the assignment. Had known it in Helmand, where the convoy ambush she'd survived had been caused by intelligence failures that were themselves caused by institutional dysfunction that was itself caused by bureaucratic incentives that prioritized efficiency over accuracy. Had known it in every VA waiting room, every benefits hearing, every conversation with a veteran who had been promised the world and given a form to fill out. She knew that justice was not a destination, it was a direction. You moved toward it, and the distance closed, and then the ground shifted, and the distance opened again, and you kept moving because the alternative, standing still, was surrender disguised as acceptance. The fluorescent lights in the federal courthouse hummed the same way the lights in South Precinct's holding cell had hummed. Institutions sounded alike because institutions were alike. Machinery designed to process human complexity into manageable categories, to reduce stories to data points, to convert people into files that could be opened, reviewed, and closed. Opal's file would be opened. The investigation would proceed. The consent decree would be negotiated, or litigated, or both. Some officers would be disciplined. Some would resign. Some would transfer to other departments, carrying their habits with them like seeds that would germinate in new soil. And somewhere on Dock Street, or South G Street, or beneath an overpass on Pacific Avenue, a veteran would wake up at 5 a.m. without an alarm, fold a sleeping bag into a rectangle that no one would inspect, and wait for a system that had promised to help to remember that it had made that promise. The light buzzed. The building breathed. The notebook waited. But now there were 2 notebooks. The one in federal custody, its 42 days of evidence being processed into findings and recommendations, and the slow bureaucratic machinery of accountability. And the new one, fresh pages, tight handwriting, the first entry dated December 6th, in which Opal Serrano continued to write, because the investigation was over. But the work was not. The work was never over. The work was the direction you moved in when standing still was not an option. She wrote the date, wrote the location, wrote the names of people who were still sleeping in tents, still waiting for cushions, still counting the days until a hearing that might give them back their children. And she kept counting.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.